Yes, I'm very good. I'm on a kind of mission.
You're on a mission.
But
What's your mission, my friend?
I cannot say now. You must wait.
Well, best of luck with the ants, and Philip and Javier. It is good to see you.
Thank you.
So Michael, what are you thinking about? What you thinking about?
Mm, yeah. Well, first, I feel excited and nervous that I've never been asked that question because I've never been the first one. I've never been the first one to get to the net.
This is the
Um,
day. This is the
this is
day,
the day.
Michael.
Yeah. Um, so so I listened to an interview on John Vervaeke's channel. It came out a couple of days ago, and it was with two psychotherapists who both treat adolescents, and they also treat other populations. But the podcast episode was titled "The Archetype of the Adolescent," and they talked about how, like, kind of just the kind of problematizing, like, treating adolescents and kind of like the difficulties and the challenges, but also like the really beautiful opportunities that it presents. And one thing that they kind of both agreed on is that adolescence is, like, one of them kind of said something pretty provocative. She was like, the three most important times in one's life are their birth, their adolescence, and their death. And 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 she was like, as a modern culture, we really don't understand how to um meet adolescents where they are. And her theory was that adolescence is kind of this liminal space between childhood and adulthood. And so, when a child is born, and when they're through kind of infancy, the they're kind of this volatile, cantankerous. They're crying a lot and things, but there's a way in which the role as a parent is pretty, like, clear. It's like this person is defenseless. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They can't be trusted to make decisions on their own, and so you're kind of this caretaker. But then once they, like, get into their kind of teenage years, it's like they all of a sudden have this desire to differentiate and to become an individual, to start making decisions on their own, to explore, new ways of being, new hobbies, new friend groups, new activities. um, and and there's a necessity in the parents stepping back and allowing the child to make mistakes. They talk about, like, virtuous mistakes. But then there's also, like, all these kind of trap doors that you don't want them to walk into that maybe you walked into at that age, and you're like, okay, like, what mistakes do I allow them to make, and what mistakes can I really see how this could be, like, potentially really destructive and detrimental and things. um and so it kind of led me down this, like, rabbit hole of, like, just thinking about my adolescence, and just thinking about, um that critical time period. And it led me to getting this book by Dostoevsky called The Adolescent. And I don't know if you've read it, Daniel, judging by that reaction, but it's actually one of his, like, least known books. And it was his second to last book that he wrote before he died. It was like 4 years before the brothers Karamazov. And it was written through the perspective of this 19-year-old kid. And it's just like it's a very different tone from most of his books. Are, like, they're very dark, mysterious. And this book's much, just much different because of who it's written in the perspective of. And it kind of, a lot of his critics and peers kind of condemned the book because they were like, this is not Dostoevsky. Like, this is not, like, the patented Dostoevsky. I'm just started it. I'm like 40, 50 pages in, but uh, like, I've just really been thinking about, like, just how, in culture, I feel like there's a lot of grown-ups who have failed to go through adolescence properly,
Hmm.
and they are kind of acting with, like, their adolescent parts are kind of like acting out. And maybe they don't even know it because, like, they didn't properly go through adolescence. And now it's kind of like these like immature, like, you know, impulsive, reactive parts are kind of coming out. And so I've just really been thinking about like how to set the conditions for adolescence to happen, and then to make way for adulthood. And one last thing before I pass it back, like I've just also been thinking about the idea of like you can't transcend the ego without having one first. And I think that's kind of a key part of like the adolescent period, is like really having an ego. And you know, like they talked about in the interview that like there's so much of a pressure, and I've noticed this. I've worked a lot with kids and volunteered a lot with kids since high school. There's like a pressure or like a desire to like to kind of like mold kids into adults too early. Like, you know, you see a kid like just being really selfish or acting out or only thinking about themselves, and you want to make them mature. And they were saying like it's actually a feature, not a bug, of adolescence to be egocentric. Like they need that to be able to like realize who they are, but then also to realize like, oh, there's like some parts of this ego that are like kind of hurtful, and then going on a path to understanding how to transcend that. But like they first have to have the experience of having one to realize that. So I've just been thinking a lot about that recently, and you know, also thinking about, you know, your idea of Deleuzian childhood, and how even as adults, that like how do we mature past adolescence while still retaining the aspects of childhood that are healthy and needed for philosophia. Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. And I like this emphasis on it sometimes seems easier to speak about raising children than raising adolescents. The adolescence is like, oh, well, hopefully they're in middle school and so overwhelmed by AP classes and homework that, you know, the amount of interaction is limited because it's too confusing or different things, or they get reduced to puberty or something, when there seems to be actually this fairly fascinating question, and I'll have to watch that talk on the cultivation that occurs in adolescence and how that does seem to be extended fairly profoundly into the rest of an individual's life. And that's quite fascinating. I'll pass it to Philip and Javier here. I mean, it also definitely seems like if indeed you want to make a working industrial economy people, then you want them to, in the adolescent age, structure their ethics and morality about getting the test done, doing the homework assignments, doing what they're told in different things, and falling in line with the commodity form, because that then becomes kind of the basis of the association of their thinking. And now I'm kind of wondering, indeed, we often talk about in the society kind of, oh, you know, Freudian, getting back to the mom or the phallus or the father, and these are kind of more child sort of associations of how people live their lives. But it is interesting to think how much of our ethical system, perhaps, or our notions of what we should do and what we shouldn't do, how we should relate to people, is actually more so determined in the adolescent years. Maybe, maybe not. It also makes me think of that one book, and I can't remember, The Nurture Fallacy, that emphasizes that really the biggest thing that contributes to how children end up is their peer group. We overemphasize the role of parents, actually, in nurturing children. It's not that you can, let's put it this way, you can do a whole lot as a parent to break your kid, but not that much to determine how they're going to end up, except creating the environments where they have good peers. So you move into a role as a parent where you're almost creating a field or an environment more so than direct interaction. Now, again, there's also the idea of me speaking with Mr. Dillard every Friday, or my grandfather on the porch. And I wonder how much, though, it was almost the environment of coming into a space of like discourse and philosophy that was almost more formative than the particular ideas of them. And how that did have a big impact on me adolescently to kind of shape the sort of notion of, oh, this is how you hang out with people. This is the kind of people you want to be around, and how that actually does seem to be more in the adolescent phase. That's very interesting, but let me give it to Philip and then Javier. So Philip, please, good to see you, sir.
You too, bro. I'm so happy you brought this up, Michael. Like this is, I'm writing a piece right now for one of the philosophy portal classes on when they teamed up with Theory Underground, a book by Alenka Zupancha. It's called What is Sex? And I'm working with this fourfold model, looking at different currencies across different developmental parts of someone's life. So I start with the baby. The currency there is love. I move to the baby adult, that's a teenager. I think like the currency there, like revenge or rebellion. And then I'll fast forward to the adult, the currency there being peace. And then for the one in between those two, the adult baby, the idea being freedom, which basically is like a Heideggerian existential, not like the freedom of the peace time where you have control and power over an inflated initial ego. I love what you said about transcending the ego and how you need one first. This is something I think, like, especially in an age of social media, there's so many people who I feel like are looking to do the, well, there was a time when like the Stutz documentary came out. You have Gabor Mate, you have Jordan Peterson, right? And some people have called this like ego therapism or something like this. And indeed, I think these people are terrible if you've developed that initial ego, because they like basically give you all the tools to become a more efficient economic dominator and like speed up what some people call the meta crisis. They're indeed, from this perspective, they could be seen as narcissistic and sociopathic and Machiavellian and even sadistic. So understanding that that's needed for a lot of people to get to a certain level. Once you get to that level, something like the psychoanalyst comes in, and you can start understanding like some of what Lacan is saying. And I think this is like a path when you're becoming a baby adult, is to get the ego and then experience like a second innocence, knowing that this is like Joseph Piper, right? Fleeing from freedom. Like we start off being super afraid of freedom because it's little me, little mind, giant universe. But then it kind of, it comes in a more manageable form the second time around. I think another thing that's super important that we're scoring like a major own goal with adolescence, and I think it has to do with freak theory. Like we all know this, but it's reached this limit where it's become ubiquitous. Like we ourselves have been turned into slaves, and we actively turn our children into slaves. Try to make them cheerful slaves, hopefully pleasant slaves. But I think like everyone realizes, like with brains as big as ours, like survival should not be like our main concern. It should be tertiary at most. And I know like this may sound harsh, but we're like continually doing it to ourselves. So I think like this is a part of like the bridge project of thinking, what can we do for the children and the adolescents as the mental health crisis increases the impending techno-capital singularity looms large, is to admit that we ourselves are caught up in this. We're doing it every day, and like on some level, I think this is where Deleuze, as far as like the lines of flight, as far as the rhizomatic thinking, as far as like almost just getting off of an Oedipal frame and moving more to a schizoid, where we're like, I don't know, on some level, like keeping two sets of books, hoping that, I think as philosophers, as lovers of wisdom, like we go through a perpetual adolescence. It's just like a continual adolescence. And every time you're like, oh yeah, I've arrived, I'm now a mature character, you recognize that like that mature character is a maybe the height of self-deception. And it's probably much more in line with culture concealing our creatureliness. I'll end it with some alliteration.
No, that's fascinating. As you were speaking there at the end, there is something funny about philosophy that has this kind of perpetual adolescence, in the sense of your love, Lady Sophia, wisdom, seeking. There's a certain attraction. There's also this sort of, the classic, I know nothing. There's this kind of like, wow, just when I thought I had wisdom, that was precisely when I realized I don't know anything. So there is this interesting feeling of a kind of halting of development that actually is development, which is kind of weird. And maybe one of the problems with economics is it gives you too clear of a path of development. And therefore, the adolescence actually gets captured and, funny enough, undeveloped. Because it is interesting to think about, like you were saying, Mr. Wynn, good to see you. I'll pass it to Javier. Adolescence is this kind of rebellion. And it is funny to think how much of our life is actually in the shadow of what we define as rebellion, or how we think about rebellion. And there's a way in which philosophy has a kind of rebellion, in the sense of I'm not just going to think the zeitgeist, but it's different from the I know better than everyone rebellion, right? Not all rebellions are equal. There's something kind of, I guess it was funny, like I never thought about it, but then people like in middle school or high school or middle school, it's like, oh, so you just meet with older guys on Friday? Yeah. And it was almost like a rebellious act to not just go do what other people do in high school. I didn't think of it that way. Or writing, I guess it was rebellious to sit in the back of every class working on the Sword of Tribulation instead of paying attention. There was a kind of rebellion to that, but it was a rebellion in a kind of creative way. And I do wonder if there is something perhaps about the society that doesn't want to think adolescence, because the question of healthy and good rebellion doesn't arise. And that would make you more susceptible to just economic man, right? Because there is something rebellious about I'm going to love wisdom. I'm not going to just follow what people tell me or what I'm going to think. I'm actually going to use Michael's phrase from last week that I really like. I'm going to intend to have an intention. I'm going to rebel against this whole zeitgeist of always knowing why I'm here or what I'm doing or pragmatism. I'm going to rebel against the metrics, dang it. I'm going to rebel against quantification and actually just intend to have an intention and see what happens and love wills. There is a kind of rebellion in that, but it's different in character. It's a kind of creative rebellion. And yeah, I think that's good with the Peter said. It's interesting. It's almost like if you don't think the adolescence, you're still going to have rebellion, but it's not going to be negantropic. It's not going to be the kind of rebellion that actually helps you move outside of a monopoly of a value form, help you actually develop, and can lead to nihilism in the meaning crisis, and so on and so forth. So I think that's very interesting. And I also am interested kind of also on this idea of the econ, because it's kind of like we don't think, what is the adolescence in economics? What is the rebellion in economics? I guess entrepreneurship, or I'm going to make my own money, or I'm going to, well, it brings to mind too, there's a way in which worrying about survival is baby, right? Like that's young. You should think about that. But then we don't even, but we don't think the adolescence, because we just stay in survival mode forever. Make sure you have a job that you can survive, right? And you never grow up. And then just one day you retire. You just die, never having grown up, right? Whereas there's a certain adolescence that is, no, now I'm going to rebel against just surviving. I'm going to live, dang it. Like, I'm going to live. And there's a kind of rebellion in that that's actually healthy. So it's very interesting. This is curious, but let me pass it on to Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, good to see you today, sir.
Hi, yeah. So this is interesting. I'm glad Philip brought up What is Sex by Alenka Sponge. It's because it's got me thinking about the non-relation from Lacan, and basically, from what I understand, I haven't finished the book yet, but the non-relation from Lacan is basically saying like sex. We don't. Well, one, Supanchik is saying that we don't know what sex is. We don't even bother trying to understand the essence, or the you know, in the more Plato, we don't understand the idea of what his sex is. So this all feeds sorts of issues, because what ends up happening is, as Alenka kind of describes this brilliantly, it's like it means that we start asserting some type of normative sexuality, which definitely has to do with puberty and adulthood, becoming older. But the problem with asserting a kind of normative sexuality, it assumes that there is a sort of innate unifying sexuality. And so, you know, elaborating a little bit more, like Zupanchik is saying, like, for Freud, there is these partial drives, right? You know, you got the oral drive, the anal drive, all these other drives. But it's like the things that I hear parents complain about with their, you know, kind of puberty children is that fundamentally it has to do with these partial drives, in my opinion. You know, like, my kid is playing video games too much. You know, he doesn't like working out, or, you know, there is a fundamental problem with the partial drives, which means that for some reason, and this is what I've always found convincing about psychoanalysis, is that psychoanalysis has been really good at pointing out, why is it when it comes to biological function, when it comes to the idea of pleasure, that suddenly we find enjoyment that is in excess of its biological fitting? Why do we eat more when we don't need to eat because we've already satisfied the biological function of eating? Why do we continue to eat? Why is stress eating a thing? Why is thumb sucking a thing? Why does it never happen when the boob is there? Why does that all of a sudden thumb sucking become a kind of comforting measurement for the child? Kind of way to soothe anxiety, right? When initially the sucking part was just for getting breast milk, getting fed. So why is that in excess of itself? And so, to me, I actually think psychoanalysis has a really convincing argument, because if they don't, here's what I would say. What is the explanation for that? What is the explanation for sites of pleasure that cannot explain simple biological fittedness? Why is there an excess of our biological function? And so I think, one, there's a lot of problems there, like just explaining that gap. It doesn't have to be a psychoanalysis, but I do think psychoanalysis is trying to explain that gap. I don't hear anybody else trying to explain that gap. What everybody else does is start from when sexuality seems to occur, which is in a like puberty age, actually. That's when people get stuck on, when the supposedly biological functions start to kick in, when we start reaching puberty, and so on. But infantile sexuality, and this was like Freud's point from Supanchik, is that infantile sexuality is not much different from adult sexuality, you know? It's just, actually what ends up happening is we reduce sexuality to our organs, to the functions themselves. When, in my opinion, in my experience, that's clearly not the case. There's things that we definitely experience pleasure from, that is in excess of the biological kind of fittedness that's going on. So I think that's one gap that needs to be explained. Psychoanalysis tries to explain that gap. And then the other thing is actually this idea of, if you ever get to read this book called something Belief by Kristeva, I actually thought, oh no, it's called The Need to Believe by Kristeva. And it's actually Kristeva's psychoanalytic whole breakdown of the adolescent subject. And her opinion and her breakdown is actually has to do with belief. Adolescence has to do with belief itself. Mainly because, you know, we start off basically believing in our parents, believing what they can do and all this sort of stuff. But then adolescence is also the age when we discover that our parents are not everything. We discover new social formations, our friends, and so on. And so adolescence for Kristeva becomes a problem precisely because of belief itself. We don't even know how to relate to belief, essentially. And this is the problem for adolescence for Kristeva, is it's relating to belief. How do you relate to belief when fundamentally belief always fails? Belief never quite fits to our ideals. Our ideals never really come true, and they're never perfect, and never exactly the way they are. So this is for Kristeva exactly what captures us within the adolescent realm. It's how do we relate to belief, knowing that belief always fails us. In other words, how do we relate to lack? But this is a very particular question in terms of belief. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, outstanding. And, you know, there's a few things that comes to mind that's very interesting. So, like, what occurs in puberty, adolescence, sexual, you know, this notion, like you say, there is obviously an infantile sexuality, but there's some sort of change perhaps in the character. Whereas, generally speaking, usually the mother will offer food, the breast. They will offer places to relieve oneself, right? These are not things you so readily have to negotiate unless you're traumatized. But as you move into sex or, you know, relationship or different things, in different manners, there's a certain negotiation that occurs. You have to negotiate with someone who is not in your family, who may not love you back, right? That's another thing, like flirting. You have a crush. That's the word, crush. You have a crush on somebody, but they may not receive it. Crush is interesting too, isn't it? Because you're like crushed under something, like it's crushing you as a boulder as you have a crush. It's kind of funny. There's an interesting sort of double word there, and there's this idea that when you have a crush, like it may like blow up in your face, right? Like there's a limit possible, right? Whereas most of the time, generally, if you love your parents or your dads, they may disappoint you, but they're not going to, like, not usually, unless you're like completely effed up, like they're not going to completely abuse you, right? I mean, of course that occurs. What's interesting, I guess why I bring that up, is because it's interesting because, like, as you get like older and you're encountering situations where you have a crush on somebody or you love them and there's not necessarily the return, that also transforms. Wow, I'm in a world where that kind of thing can happen, where I can hit this certain limitation. And Christian, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well. It's a pleasure. And so, like, when you're a kid, like, there's this idea of, let's say your parents reject you. There is a feeling of like, that's unjust or that's wrong, right? Like this should not occur. But as you get into middle school and you have a crush on somebody and they reject you, it doesn't necessarily feel like justice is on your side, right? Like it doesn't feel like you're not going to necessarily get the social order come together and give you support, right? So it's possible to have your desire thwarted and it not be ethically wrong, some sort of moral invalidation, right? Whereas if you grow up in that situation, it's more likely the society will come to your side, right? That then functions as this kind of revelation of the possibility to desire something and it not necessarily be the case that you ought to get it, right? Like when you're a kid and you desire your mother's acknowledgement, your father's, there's a feeling of, yes, I ought to get it and the society backs me, right? But as you get older, you can desire things and ought not necessarily accompany you, right? It actually, well, that's just how it goes. You know, sometimes you want things or you desire things or you're after things or you're motivated toward things, but ought isn't necessarily on your side. And that then is a certain revelation of, oh my gosh, I'm being guided by something that I'm not necessarily justified or going to be supported in getting. And that leads to a certain sort of revelation of, wow, how do I respond to this thing that's guiding me toward things that I'm not necessarily going to be supported in getting, right? There can be a certain nihilism, a certain hopelessness, a certain, maybe there's a rebellion where they say, well, screw everyone, I'm going to get it, dang it. Well, F everyone, that's the kind of bad rebellion that can occur. But then there could be an integration with that reality where they go, oh, you know, I have to figure out, you know, I have to figure out how to desire things and seek things, even if there's not necessarily support for those things, and figure out what that looks like. And that's a difficult thing. And that seems to be part of the change that occurs that's kind of got to get you in different things. The other thing I am thinking about, because I've been going down and it just kind of made me think about what you were saying, that this interesting question of this adolescent desire, where there's this lack, this sort of gap, where you can eat food and there's still an excess, this relation between lack and excess, where you can want something you don't need that goes beyond biological function. I'm thinking about that because I've been trying to get a good grasp on a thinker named Terence Deacon, who wrote an interesting book called Incomplete Nature. And the thing that he wants to argue in that book that's quite interesting, he talks a lot of, you know, he basically will talk about lack in the way we do. But the main thing, and I'm thinking, I may not get into it today, but I've been thinking about putting Stuart Kauffman, Cosmology on Non-Locality as Fundamental, who also gets into the question of where order comes in biology, together with Terence Deacon on Constraint creating order, basically, is what ends up happening. And then Alex Ebert, and then relation as fundamental, like we obviously see all the people on liminal web. And I'm thinking those together as a cosmology, I think is quite interesting. But I bring up Terence Deacon here because what he points out, and he references my beloved Michel Planier, where Planier notes that order in chemistry tends to be a result of a subtraction of options. Like order is not a result of adding complexity or adding information. It's actually a result of removing information that allows chemistry to eventually combust and give you biology and so on and so forth, right? And also there's an interesting question of what is the difference between chaos, complexity, and simplicity, okay? So you have all these thinkers of like complexity science and different things. And there's this really interesting question. And interestingly, what Deacon points out is that complexity tends to be a chaos that is constrained. And that constraint creates order. Actually, constraint is what turns chaos into complexity, right? Much more can be said on that. But the reason I bring that up is because I wonder if what ends up happening is you desire as an adolescent someone and they don't return it and you're constrained, and that actually generates an order, ergo an excess, that then orders your life more so than had you not hit that constraint. And it's actually that ontological gap is a result of this cosmology that actually emerged to chemistry, biology, and then mind, that when you encounter the constraint of wanting an object you cannot access, that actually creates more order in your life that overshoots the object. Because the order that is created can't stop on the object because the constraint creates a kind of overshooting of the person. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it overshoots the food. The constraint of not having the food actually creates desire that overshoots the object because constraint creates order. Actually. And that's the great irony. You would think constraint, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants it. You would think constraint would limit order, that it would limit desire. But if Terence Deacon is correct, constraint actually creates order and creates negentropy, basically, and usable energy, right? Once you constrain desire to an object, you actually get a more sophisticated desire, which oddly then makes it overshoot the object that constrained it, that made it more sophisticated. That would be the great paradox that might start to explain why lack generates excess, because lack is a constraint that generates more order than the object of which was the constraint on the desire to create it. And so it's interesting to think Stu Kauffman, Terence Deacon, Ebert, and the relation into relata. But let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please.
Yeah, this is all so great and so helpful to kind of just my own thinking. But the last thing you said there, Daniel, about constraints, constraints basically being the prerequisite to order, affording order. I was thinking back to, kind of the plot of this book by Dostoevsky, where, it's this late adolescent, just finished high school, kid in, you know, in Russia, and he's like the illegitimate son of like a master, like a serf, basically. And so, but he's like, you know, wherever he goes to school, people think that he's like the son of this person. So they're like, oh, are you Prince such and such, when he gives his name, and he's like, no, I'm not a prince. I'm, you know, because I'm the I'm the illegitimate son of this person. And it causes him like a lot of humiliation and shame in school. And I was just thinking, connected to your idea, like that's kind of this constraint that's being placed on him. It's like, oh, you're actually not that high in the social hierarchy, you know, even though your father was, like, because, you know, you're not actually related to him, like, you know, and he gets bullied and teased, and that kind of creates all this like bitterness and resentment in him. He's like this kind of very judgmental kind of young man as a result. And I think adolescence is like just a period of constantly like overreaching in the pursuit of like ultimate freedom and kind of chaos, and like having the world give you, like, bumping up against your own limitations and like the kind of crushing realization that like you won't be able to realize like all of your loftiest dreams, or at least it's going to be a lot more complex and difficult than you thought. And so that makes a lot of sense to me, and how that kind of shapes and matures someone and like orients them towards like constructing more order in their life. Like once they kind of have that clarified vision from the kind of brutal realization of the world and kind of the pain and suffering that comes with it. But I think an important distinction to make is between constraints that are imposed externally and ones that you realize through your own volitional actions. So, and here's where I think people who don't go through adolescence well, and, you know, realize when I'm framing that it might seem like it's accusational. It's not at all. It's just the product of how we rear and raise children. Is that there are all of these constraints that are imposed, you know, by the school system, by society, by just what you quote unquote can and can't do at a familial level with adolescence, that I think can actually lead to more chaos, because then there's a potential for that rebellion that we were talking about earlier, where someone feels so like trapped and small and like closed in, where then they just kind of want to, like, you know, take an axe and just destroy all of the concrete walls that were, you know, like built around them. Whereas someone who's like given the freedom to explore and go out into the world, who gets scraped up and bruised, that seems like there's like a responsibility and an ownership of those constraints, that I think that person's much more willing and able to accept their limitations and to kind of construct their own order, as opposed to the order being externally imposed in kind of an authoritarian way. Yeah, that kind of seems like the last thing I wanted to mention. I'll pass it back.
No, outstanding. Well, it definitely, what's interesting is there's a difference between the constraint of an external constraint and the constraint that arises inherent from your very desire for a thing, of which eventually reaches, it encounters its inability to just get it by virtue of wanting it. You have to negotiate with the person you have a crush on, right? You have to negotiate with the world that doesn't give you the money to buy whatever you want, right? So there's something seemingly different between the limitation that is imposed upon you by something external and the limitation that emerges from within the desire itself because of itself. And perhaps that is that is the adolescent moment where you find in your very desire a limitation that comes in the desire, which seems different from when you're a child. Yeah, you know there are limits. You have to go to bed at 10 o'clock. You know that you can't go outside just any time of day. There are certain limits, but they're not your limits as a result of yourself from inside yourself, right? So they seem to have a different existential relation to them. What almost happens in the adolescent is, oh, I want something that is not necessarily imposed. Sure, maybe you're influenced subconsciously and don't know it, but that's not how you experience it. You experience it typically as something that just, you fall in love, you find yourself in something, and that thing you find yourself in has a certain limit that hits you, right? And what's very interesting, again, what's interesting to me, and also with Dostoevsky, it's wonderful in that example because there's a constraint that generates story, right? That very constraint is kind of the basis of why a story is then possible, right? And Deacon would be like, exactly, constraint creates form and order. But then he asks a very interesting question, where is the constraint? Is constraint part of the thing? Is it lacking? Is it external? There's a lot, and that's why I think Kaufman could be interesting. But what's interesting to me, just as we're talking, then I'll give it to Javier here, is this idea of you. So you as an adolescent, I'll just use the example of the crush because it's a simple one. You have a crush, your desire meets the limit of the girl not liking you or something, which then, if Deacon is correct, that very focus of the desire complexifies it in a manner that the object may not be able to contain it. That's the weird thing. Like your desire may gain a certain complexity or dimensionality or robustness that then the person you've fallen in love with, it's beyond them. But the whole reason it actually complexifies as such is because of that object that focused it into a complexity that now overshoots it, right? And that is the hilarious joke that seems to be necessary for development. And then you could also say the ladder of being, analogy of being, like that's the joke. Oh, you're actually looking for beauty because beauty is the only thing that can focus your desire and actually contain whatever complexity it may arise at, right? That's where you fall back onto these infinite, good, true, and beautiful. That's the only thing that you can focus your desire on, and your desire as a result be complexified, be given more dimensionality, but not overshoot the object, right? And then people or things that participate in that infinity could actually contain it. So it's interesting to think that the very act of desiring an object that you cannot have is why it's like your desire grows up, per se, right? And maybe what ends up happening, and I'll give it to Javier and then Mr. Jockin, is that we have a society where adolescents are getting a desire that encounters a limit, and we as a society do not have the mechanisms to help them grow up in the realization of what that desire, oh, your desire is unveiling to you a certain limitation that complexifies it. Yeah, that's how desire works. That's because you're supposed to move in this direction. No, we just throw cake at you. Or other objects, like, well, it must be because you have the wrong object, right? As opposed to saying, no, this is because desire in of itself entails a focusing that complexifies it to be seeking some sort of, dare I say, infinity, some sort of emergence, some sort of things that can ever develop it. And that's why we see stunted as an adolescent society. But let me pass to Javier and then Mr. Jockin. Javier Rivera.
All right, so yeah, no, this is good because like this makes me like think why when I came up with the term limit negative, it suddenly became so useful as a term. Because fundamentally the idea of limit negative is trying to lump up other terms, group other terms that fundamentally don't change or are indifferent to us as human beings. So what would those be? I think you gave a perfect example of it, which is desire. Desire is that sort of limit negative where it's like, if you attain it's a double-edged sword either way, right? If you attain the object, you start worrying whether you can keep the object. This is the perfect example of the excess of desire that is there. Like for some reason, the satisfaction doesn't stop at once attaining it. It goes to, can I keep it? And then you also feel like, can it keep me happy? Is it keeping me happy? Is it the object that I actually wanted? And these are all questions that sort of just prop up the moment you attain it. So even if we get the person that we have a crush on, there's always going to be that desire that looms over as questions that sort of says, oh, is she actually the one I wanted? Is this what, is this actually working out? Or so on, and I think this can be felt in a variety of ways. You can either start feeling like you will lose it, or you can start feeling like you don't have the ability to keep it because you maybe don't want it. So that's something that I call the limit negative, because desire will always be that very limit. It's not something that can be actually attained or fully satisfied. So it's a limit negative. So thinking about adolescence in relation to limit negatives, fundamentally, in my idea, is that ideals always come up as a mediation that obscures the reality of the limit negative. So it means that if we attempt to construct an idealized adolescent subject, it cannot contain the incompleteness that is of desire itself. But another thing is, for example, Michael, you gave this example of like, they can go out and discover a kind of constraint or something. There's some element of discovery for the adolescent. But for me, it assumes a kind of normative capacity in general. Like it already assumes a capacity that is normative for all adolescents. For example, like autistic children, I don't think we would be able to say the same for autistic children. In fact, we might actually have to rethink what we even think about when it comes to a kind of linear progression of child, adolescent, and adulthood when it comes to somebody that is actually autistic. Right? Because then we don't really even have like a kind of normative linear progress of a child. Right? In some sense, people might say they remain as a child. They stay as a child. There is no adolescence being involved. I think that's one temptation, but I think the other temptation is that it's perhaps shows that there is no fundamental normative that can capture the trajectory of an adolescent, a proper adolescent being. And I think I think the reason why is precisely because there is no theory of everything. There is no possible ideal that could capture the full, the sort of lack of an adolescence, what it means to be an adolescent. Because it assumes so much. It assumes normative capacities, what everyone can or cannot do. It assumes what we're capable of encountering immediately and not immediately. And so we have a problem, but I think this is why I think adolescence may have to do more with a pinnacle encounter with failure than anything else. So I would invert Michael's ideal, where we would say that there is no ideal. So how do you live with that limit negative? The limit negative of there is no ideal, but you will always desire one, which is another limit negative. You always desire an ideal. You always want to believe. You always want to feel satisfied in something and doing something. The question is, how do you relate? How can we relate? Because in some ways, we're forced to relate. So it's not even a question of, I can't relate or whatever. We're forced to relate. This is the ultimate constraint that kind of, you could say in Daniel's terms, actually feeds the complexity of even understanding the adolescent child. It completely overshoots what it means to understand the adolescent, precisely because there is no ideal, and yet we keep desiring one. The question then would be, yeah, I mean, this is the problem, I think. Just the fact that the social sphere will always assert another normative ideal. But the problem with that is not the normative ideal itself, is the problem that the normative ideal can never fully capture the adolescent event, you could say. It just never will fully capture it. So I think there's that gap that still needs to be thought, which is, how do we relate to the fact that nothing will ever fully capture the relation itself to actually satisfy the ideal. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Sure, lovely. I'll pass it to Mr. Jockin. I think certainly there's a fact of when we start talking about norms or ideals or different things, it becomes problematic. The question becomes the surprise, the encounter. What is the quality or characteristic that seems to, like when we think about adolescence as a period of time, then that could be kind of problematic. But instead, if it is a certain situation, a certain surprise, a certain encounter that occurs, that then leads to, if people respond to or address poorly, can lead to various pathologies. If they respond to it well, can lead to certain maturities. Then I think, like, we've talked about encounterology, and there's certainly a way in which to think about these encounters that occur, I think becomes more useful than thinking about what is norm and what is normative, because then you can say, yes, 92% of people in a society will have the encounter between the years of 10 and 20, but we can't say 100% because there's the 5% that are psychologically different, et cetera, so forth. And if there's an emphasis on the encounter that is arising to certain functions of development or what we need to think, and the surprise, that also helps us work against overly oppressive, neurotic, totalitarian structures, normatives, and also forces us to think the surprise and how we can respond to the other, the man on the side of the road, as Ivan Illich says. And I like, the emphasis on encounter, because then it allows something like saying, yeah, 92% of people are going to have this encounter in their life with a certain limitation in this period, but it doesn't become a normative. A likely encounter is not a unavoidable encounter in every person's life at a different period of time. So you make room for that face in Levinas, that man on the side of Rome in Ivan Illich, and you put emphasis on skills and capacities to handle something that is unexpected, as opposed to having all the answers that apply universally in all circumstances, as we've talked about with encounters and limits, and so on and so forth. I'll pass it to Jockin and Philip. The other thing I was thinking about, I should clarify, Michael made the correct point that as you get more complexity, you can actually get more chaos, right? Like as you get greater complexity and more restrictions, you can get, that's exactly right. In the same way that it's the saint in Christianity who can become the devil. Like the greater the capacity for good, the greater capacity for evil, right? And what's very interesting is the more complexity that develops, the greater chaos that is possible, precisely because of that complexity, if it is not continually rightly ordered. But how it is ordered, Father Terrace Deacon, is a result of the response to the constraint. But constraints can't be known ahead of time. That's the tricky thing about a constraint. That's why, like a universal map and having the answers, constraints always have to surprise. So this is the human condition. As we develop and become more, dare I say, complex, or at least have the potential for greater complexity, that means the more important it is to rightly respond to something that's unpredictable. So how do you know what you need? Oh, you don't, but if you screw up, the chaos is greater. Oh, lovely. That's great. And this is partly of what it means to be a human being. And the other thing that should be noted is that if you gain complexity, and you say, well, I don't like this, I want to go back, per se, I want to go back to simplicity, it would require chaos. So like if you want to go back to a simpler desire, you have to introduce chaos to the complexity to remove the variables to go back to a repression. So there's a repressive structure that happens. So if you go back, but then the issue is, it's almost like as you get older into adolescence and you encounter the object that focuses your desire and creates complexity, you're like, well, I didn't know this was going to happen. I want to go back. Well, you can't go back now without retarding the complexity through an introduction of chaos, maybe to your emotional self, maybe to your family life, there has to be chaos in the system somewhere to get back to the simplicity, which then, of course, creates maybe a potential trauma that you're not ready for. And so there's a structure to reality via desire that leads to a complexification of that desire that then, if you just want to go back to the simple, requires a certain retardation or repression or problem that then creates a trauma. Oh, and by the way, you then know that you went back to simplicity. So it's not the same as the simplicity you had to a child, because you know you went back, whereas as a child, you just had it. So it moved from being a Hegelian determination to something that's chosen. And once it's chosen, it changes in its capacity for existential stability and meaning. So then it actually feels like a retreat. And so simplicity, when you're younger, that doesn't feel like a retreat, becomes a retreat. And it then would almost require greater repression, ergo more of just plugging into the machine, trying to be thoughtless, trying not to think about it, and then banality of evil, Hannah Arendt, and other things. There's more to be said, but let me pass it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please, then Philip, and then Christian. Mr. Jockin.
Good to see everybody. You know, Daniel, I like your proposition, your question about that odd sense of awe and desire, which with the parent-child dynamic to the and kind of any other conditionals, like basically a desire, crush of a beloved, right? Like a high school sweetheart or something. It seemed to be like my first instinct, just hearing that, is that it seems to be a difference of things of content, of necessity, based on the formal structure of the relationship versus contingency. That actually seems to be the biggest distinction I'm sensing. Because the whole pretense is that things that are contingent, you may get and may not get. There's no necessity attached to it. There's no guarantee you're going to get it. And I say that because that's true with friendship. Friendship is not family, because now Aristotle has a really interesting note about that. Husband and wife can be friends, but it's not the primary orientation. Its primary orientation is over its necessity function to generate children. That's its purpose. The secondary of accidental property of friendship could be possible. Aristotle acknowledges, but it's not the necessity of it. And I say it because of all that means all applies to all the friendship categories: utility, pleasure, and virtue. These are all contingencies. These are all contingently the case. And I say that because, and I kind of circle back on that, because so for my Plato course, we had a whole section on temperance, on 2 notes about it. Kind of one of the elements of childhood. And actually, that transitional period is one of the problems, is basically overstepping the line. So one of the lines of temperance is both the kind of, there's a language about bias and hubris, kind of overstepping the line of desire, and as well as basically the orientation of that desire. That can go both ways. Now, normally that gets read as the self-denial, the kind of restricting side, but in the Phaedrus dialogue, it's presented the other way, which is, desire the best. That's what we're trying to aim for. But that choice of what one desires is actually ultimately what articulates the person. Okay, but I'm just bringing that up because I remembered something from Aristotle. He talked about how temperance protects prudence, and prudence has an element within it called cleverness. Cleverness is the function, the faculty of the soul to achieve what's desired. So the whole pretense is that someone that's basically conniving versus someone with prudence. The difference is the aim of the desire being satisfied. If it's a noble good, a kalos, it is prudence. It brings you towards that orientation. If it's a base desire being fulfilled by cleverness, it's conniving. To use one English translation of it. So right there, the kind of achievement of contingent things is translated as cleverness. Virtue has it. Prudence particularly must have it. Because it doesn't exhaust it, but it includes it. But that is oriented by temperance to desire, basically what is being desired. So I'm just kind of connecting what Plato said to what Aristotle is commenting on. And I say that because prudence is very particular, because it is the application of goodness in particular circumstances, as an example, as opposed to Sophia, which is in Aristotle's account supposed to be about universals that are, and it's very key. One of the major distinctions is time dependence. Time variance versus time invariance. Archives, basically principles of Sophia, are supposed to be invaluable, to like indifferent at time. Time has no standing on it. A circle is a circle, regardless of what time we talk about it. To give one reference. However, of course, almost all of life, human existence, is in the life of prudence, because it's not just the fact, and Aristotle makes a comment about it. You can be completely correct about the proposition, the initial syllogism, but then the particular application, how much, when, at what time, and to whom, all technes, basically this is the techne mode of knowledge, these are elements of prudence. Those matter. You miss one of those, whoopsie daisy, you faltered, you failed. I bring this up because, okay, let's go back with this adolescence. Isn't the ultimate product, like kind of the definition of adolescence then? It's this encounters of failure of continually misapplying the universals to the particular circumstances. Like, because children know what's right and wrong. I mean, children learn. I've seen my nephews at a very young age. They know what is right and wrong. They pick up the social, at the very minimum, the normative standards are clear to them very early in age. But the problem comes later in life is when you have complexity of multivariable variations that are with so many multiple variables in play that are codependent on each other. Which one is the right one? What is the right? It is a very simple part. When to get mad at someone. When is it appropriate to get mad at someone and fight, to actually strike back at someone who pisses you off, right? They get bullied. That is dependent on so many variables. How much, at what time, to whom, all these things. That in certain prudential, I mean, obviously some people would say, no, you can never hit anyone at any time. I mean, but that's not totally true because we acknowledge self-defense is perfectly justifiable. So then what is it? Are you supposed to hit people or are you not? I only say that because when I first learned boxing, that actually was a very cognitive dissonant moment. Because like, wait a minute, I was given all the social ordering not to hit anyone. And now I'm put in this one context where it's totally permitted. It was actually a deal with discordance in my mind about that. Yeah, Javier, ethics of the real, very good. So my point is like this the kind of encounters of failure is what it can, almost you can say is the essence. When you give basically the essence, the nature of adolescence is that just continual failure of responding to contingent desire, trying to be satisfied, that is going to be is encountered in failure. And generally, we generally as a society, we usually give people credit. We usually give a kind of looser touch of punishment or judgment when people are in that development phase. It's kind of true. I mean, I feel like intuitively, if someone, for example, shoplifting, for example, a teenager doing it, a 12, 13-year-old doing it versus a 25-year-old male, for example, there's the storekeeper's decision to press charges or not are going to be colored by that kind of intonation. Not all the time, but I would argue that I feel like that'd be a very intuitive response. But the reason is why would that be? And they both did the same thing. Why is the 12-year-old not going to be held in justice to doing the crime versus the 25-year-old? The only way I can explain that is that we acknowledge that even though children do have they're part of society, they have the normative standard of society as universal principles kind of put on them, like they're there, but their knowledge of application of in a particular circumstances and is not necessarily so clear. It's ambiguous. It's not totally fully resolved. And part of that is also nature of what is even being desired in the first place too, no? In the sense of, this is the ladder of love. It's a huge point. Because actually Aristotle makes a very clear point about that. Youth have friendships of pleasure because they usually are associated by common pleasures. What happens when they grow up and they they stop liking the same thing? They stop liking the same band or the same hobby or whatever. It destroys the friendship. It doesn't exist anymore. Versus things that have more permanence. Utility is more common. But he said that most curmudgeonly adults have that problem. They just end up in utility friendships, right? Because they're just useful for each other for making money, for example. Which is more withstanding than pleasure, but not necessarily as long as virtue. So, I mean, all this comes down to like kind of play. It happens a couple of times in Plato's dialogues of Algama. The it's a divine statue, it's a statue of a goddess, but it's also associated with kind of almost iconic redound value or kind of bequeathing essence of value by what you associate with. Hyperdex and Phaedrus is a whole hierarchy of the gods. For example, Socrates is presented as an algama to Alcibiades in Symposium, for example. So it's basically and that's I say that because that means that, remember my conversation with Michelle about the icons of persons, in the sense that persons can be iconic exemplars for others to orient around. And in fact, for teenagers especially, who have to get the point, like how are they going to learn the application of prudence? It is through the mediation of what icons they mediate with. And today, this was almost like, because I remember when I first jumped on, there's this comment about youth culture. I'm of the opinion, I've seen other scholars say this, that the contemporary youth culture is only 1960s, maybe 1900. Like I've seen some argumentation where the demarcation is, but generally I'm more sympathetic to the youth culture of the 1960s because of the mass media element of it. So the use of coordinated images to regulate the basically discordant desires of youth. And one of that parts of it is icons, celebrities. Like these old things are like people oriented around. This is actually why things like Andrew Tate being the exemplar for a male essence of the male essence, it's considered problematic for many people, because the concern is that these youth are going to imitate Andrew Tate as what it means to be a male. That is the exemplar. And then they're going to apply imitatively what he does or what he says to their particular circumstances. And whoopsie daisy. Yes. Oh, Luber, nice to know. Nice to know. Okay. I appreciate everyone's humoring me because I was listening in for this whole time. But I think in general, like this idea of temperance with prudence, particularly, and then the point of desire satisfaction by things that are contingent by nature, it seems to be almost the essence of teenagehood and the big issue here. And usually the way we mediate this is through communities of images or mediation of images that guide basically by imitation ways of encountering failure and mediating it in a way that is not complete destruction. Well, and last thing, it almost this is actually and I bring this up because in the relationship of the archetype, the first principles with eidos by paradigms, that's discussed in Parmenides from Plato. This is almost an articulation about that in the sense of the absolute the universals are applied as archetypes. The particular expressions of them are the eidos. But then what are the patterns, the patterns in which people, communities orient around to help basically mediate the tension of failure between the universals and the particulars of circumstances, especially oriented against time. And that's all for me.
Outstanding. I'll give it to Philip, Christian, and then Javier. And Andrew Luber, it's good to see you, sir. I love this. I think you're ready to do sheep clipping, where you can like cut the hair off sheep. You were all over it with Heidi there. Very interesting on the contingency. There is something about adolescence that seems to be an introduction to contingency. I think that's very well put. What's interesting, and this is where, for me, thinking the possibility, without going into it, on Kaufman and Deacon together on Incomplete Nature, is contingency a constraint? It would seem like it's not, because if it's contingent, you're like, I can choose multiple things. But actually, there is a constraint in it because it cannot be universalized. It is temporal. It is temporary now, and it is not given. So you don't have the option of universality, and that constraint for Deacon is what creates order. So here's the irony. Adolescence could be defined as a realization of desiring something. Your desire could be contingent, which is simultaneously a constraint that thus complexifies your desire. And so you come to experience simultaneously the contingency of reality, the complexity and greater sophisticated of desire, precisely when you had no idea you were going to encounter it. And now prudence and temperance are more important than ever before, and you've never had to think about it. Good luck, kid. Have fun. And it all happens, boom, right there. And so you have in the encounter of the contingency a constraint on the possibility of universality or non-contingency, of which then creates an order and complexity to your desire of that contingent thing right when you weren't encountering or expecting any of that. And now you have to figure it out, and your model is Andrew Tate. Good luck. And so there's like that precisely then when you find yourself in that environment means you need an intentional environment, which here's the thing, complexification of desire needs models because models have a higher dimensionality than moral premises, right? So if you don't have models and you have this surprise of all of these variables coming together, bringing together Terence Deacon and all of that, and what the reason, well, I won't get into it because if non-locality is fundamental, then there's a contingency at the basis of reality, which is a constraint that then generates negentropy without violating the laws of entropy. So that's how we might be able to get a cosmology, putting together Deacon, Kaufman, and then Alex Ebert. But it's very interesting to think that the introduction of contingency is actually in that contingency a constraint that complexifies your desire to overshoot the object because the object cannot contain your desire now because it has a higher dimensionality. So there's a joke. Mr. Jockin.
There's one thing to clarify. I mean, my personal, I know you said that your statement was like the teenage desires be contingent. I would only just qualify to say, I think it's a realization that their desires are contingent. Like yes. It's not just that they want to be contingent. It's that the things that they will grant them satisfaction, or I think they will give them satisfaction. They're no longer bounded by necessity. Yes. I only say it because I was just chewing on this. Just one note. It's not like toddlers don't desire things; they don't get it. But the whole pretense is on the context of the parents mediating it, or the adult mediating it. So there's like this literal object of necessity that's orientating, coordinating that child's desire. So even when it's denied by a force of necessity. But that's kind of the whole point. Is that teenage, you realize you encounter things that are denying things to you, not by necessity. It's just contingent.
Yes.
So just to close, I
completely agree.
I think it's important, that distinction there.
Yes, there's a contingency that kind of runs down it, like the whole sort of gambit. And then you're limited and constrained from that not being the case, which then, of course, is kind of traumatic because you thought it was the case because your parents created the environment where it was, and then it wasn't. So what's going on? What do I think? What do I think? And then there's a certain sort of shock that occurs, the shock of difference. The other thing I was going to say that's also interesting about this is if you introduce contingency too soon in a child's life, like their parents aren't there or it's like a chaotic environment, the children don't develop, right? So you can't introduce contingency too soon, which then you would like, well, let's overcome that problem Jockin just said by introducing contingency at the start, right? Let's just do it. Well, then it's chaos, but then they have to meet it when they're an adolescent, so they have to go through this situation, right?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just had a note. I in the very beginning, I just forgot because I had all the other things to say. This is like that thing. It's called parentification. That's exactly what happens. It actually destroys children. It destroys them because it actually imposes on them to have to respond to contingency, and when they're not equipped to it, and they're not equipped to it because they've not developed prudence in the sense of applying the universal principles to the particular circumstance. So a lot of parentified children become hyper rationalized. They actually become overly dependent on reason, on extreme rationalization and cutting off of emotion because they can't trust it and they need to rely on it. Basically, they're grabbing at the instrument available, which is the universals, and trying to stamp it into every circumstance. Sorry to interrupt. I had that in my notes before.
No, well, that explains what happened to Nick Land. His childhood was odd. He was an adult too soon. But that's all very interesting because what it means is that this situation of adolescence with this surprise of complexification and contingency is a necessary circumstance. You can't cheat it. You can't introduce contingency early. You have to end up as Dante at midlife in a dark wood. Like, this is unavoidable in a sense. And yet that very determination is oddly marked by an encounter with contingency, which makes me think of the philosophy of right conference coming up that I need to do that paper for. But let me pass it to Philip, Christian, and Javier. Philip, please.
I find it always best to wait till the last possible moment to start any paper. And then all of a sudden it just kind of gushes out. Nick Land's gonna be right. It's just kind of a question of time. It's like we're probably, I mean, maybe there are some people that say we'll outlive the sun as a species. I want to push back a little bit on the idea of that there's an appropriate time to hit someone back. I think one of the things with Socrates or with Aristotle and Plato that a lot of people bring up, they're rather egocentric compared to their Eastern philosophical counterparts. They place like a ton of, importance on what's going on the inside of someone, how do they create rules for themselves. And as far as like a sort of Byung-Chul Han friendliness that is an openness to all things, I think it starts to become like a question of style, a question of like, who do you choose as like someone that's like, I don't even know. This is like a yes and a no, right? Like your transference. Like, can you have a conscious choice of transference? Maybe, but it might be one of these Nachträglichkeit, like this retroactive idea. I think even a little bit of like Nid Tartan, who is just like the way an army should be. I mean, I think even Simone Weil talks about this, is like, just let the other army kill you. like who cares? On some level, like what, like you really think your life is so important? But then the person is like, oh, no, 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 I'm afraid. I'm afraid. So long as it's the person next to me that, takes the shot, then I'm all for doing this thing for my country. And I wonder like how much of that comes down to this choice of authority. And I think like on some levels when we're young, like with the 12-year-old versus the 25-year-old, it's like we agree as we go on as humans, we're somehow less hampered by impulse and hormones, emotions, maybe even too, dependent upon where you are. I don't know if this is such a good metric. Like, I know this is how we've set up the judicial system, but I wonder if there, like a system of the future might have more individual, like a 60-year-old could have the emotional capacity of a 2-year-old. And we'll do this with like seriously obvious cases now. But I wonder sometimes what that, like what we're actually thinking. Are we actually thinking like this person has a fully developed prefrontal cortex and they knew what they were doing, they knew it was wrong, they did it anyway? And how that kind of can like go into relationships, and then how we like, I'm reminded of what Javier said about the limit negative, how we paper that over with contracts. So we like find a way to make a contract, and then we're like, all right, well, it's this way because the people who have the monopoly on force have said so. So either obey this dictate or don't. And then how it works in relationships, because a lot of people start serious relationships when they're adolescents, and it either goes really, really well, really, really terribly, or some I don't know, somewhere in between. And I wonder like what amount of difference in values like certain relationships can take. I find this is very interesting. Like if someone is like, I think it's valuable to examine life, and someone else is like, I'd prefer not to. I'm just gonna huck and pray. Like, is that going to be a really difficult dynamic? Like someone that's like, I like Lacan, and someone's like, I like Heidegger. It's like, oh man, they're fucked. And like how do these, yeah, I guess like differences in style, authority, and transference meet with just the necessities of keeping yourself alive in the culture we find ourselves.
No, I think those are wonderful comments. I mean, arguably, one of the reasons we just kind of turn to law or the neurotic is so that we don't have to think situationally or discern those possible differences or think about it. It's too difficult. Therefore, we'll just look at the kind of linear structure, not get into the variables, because otherwise we'd have to make judgments and discernments and could be wrong, and we would be responsible for it, right? And perhaps there's a way in which the revelation, proper revelation of the adolescence is the necessity to think that encounter. We don't like that, so let's stuff the adolescent into a school system that kind of trains them in a particular direction or different things, right? I think it's like the question of pacifism is always kind of interesting with Simone Weil or different things. I find it, without going down the hole, I find it easier to not punch someone back if they punch me as opposed if they punch Michelle or the person next to me. Or what if they're going to kill other people if I don't do something? It's very interesting. Very often in the philosophy of like pacifism or not attacking, it tends to be about you laying down your life. Well, what if they're going to kill someone else? Do you have the right to make the decision not to fight them back when that person, say, maybe is culpable, right? Or that they're responsible. So like the pacifism that's going to affect other people versus yourself becomes a much more interesting for me ethical question, right? Because do you have the ethical right to decide if someone else is a martyr? You might be able to decide if you're a martyr, but what about someone else, right? Do you have that capacity, right? And then, like, why is it necessary? And then, of course, there's the question of Is it the case that all violence is bad, right? Maybe not, right? That's also a kind of notion that's kind of lingering, a certain presumption that violence is bad, therefore don't fight back. Who said? Like, why is violence necessarily bad under all circumstances, or et cetera, so, or even in general, you could even say, right? There are different questions, but it is interesting to think of pacifism if it's going to get other people killed versus you. Should you stop that person if they're going to kill someone else? If they're going to kill you, well, you decide you're a pacifist and you're not going to lay down your life. But if I said I'm a pacifist, so I'm not going to shoot that guy that's going to launch a nuke and kill 1 million children, that makes me sound demented, right? I go from being like a noble person who's willing to die for my beliefs to someone who's kind of demented because I'm now getting 1 million children killed or something, right? So it's an interesting question. I mean, that to me, let me just put it this way. To have a philosophy of pacifism that's coherent, and actually I think real to life, because I think most people actually tend to engage in self-defense to defend other people, not themselves. That's why like governments and war and just warfare, all these things are very complex, because it's not merely the decision for your life, but if other people's lives will be destroyed. And that's to me has to be the basis for like for thinking pacifism in that way, right? But I did have this image of, I think it's The Pale King, where David Foster Wallace talks about two armies standing across from one another, looking at one another, and there will be no victor nor winner, but they will stare. Kind of image from The Pale King. I was thinking of the two armies. That was quite nice. Let me pass it on to Christian and Javier. Christian, good to see you today, sir. I hope you have been doing well. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, good to see you too. So, geez, I mean, there's been like thousands of words spoken since I raised my hand, and many subtopics brought up. One question I have for you, you made a comment, Daniel, that constraints are necessarily unexpected. And I could guess at what you mean there and what's behind that, but I'd love for you to say more. And a few thoughts and anecdotes. So on the point about having to, I'm rephrasing it here a bit, but having to like basically re-traumatize yourself in order to move from a certain, let's see. Well, I'm not recalling exactly the words you use, so you might have to correct me here. But you're speaking about how, when certain constraints lead to one becoming more complexified. I'm gonna just not pretend to quote you accurately and just make statements. Let's say that people they run up against constraints. Those constraints lead to complexification within themselves, and at some point, that complexification can become a certain kind of simplification when it becomes integrated. It's there. You get efficiencies that are afforded, and various processes no longer take up so much energy, and so on. But along those lines, interesting observation made by Jeffrey Martin, who studies conscious states of consciousness and what's generally called awakening and whatnot, was talking about how certain altered states of consciousness where one feels no sense of agency, like the ego is kind of evaporated, and they really don't like that. There's some kind of sub process which creates friction. It's uncomfortable, it's whatever, they've jumped into the ice cold water and they're not happy there. Well, the only known way to then revert back to your previous sense of self is with trauma, basically. And that can happen intentionally or unintentionally, where someone might have some kind of spiritual awakening and they have like a persistently different state of consciousness, but then they undergo some type of extreme tragedy. Their mom dies, something like this. And then they lose that persistent awakening. But then other people purposely try to get out of that state of selflessness by drumming up and kind of stewing in difficult emotions. recalling, difficult things, anything that probably generates fear, discontent, anxiety, stress, and all of that. And then they can successfully move back into a more like egoic state of consciousness with all its niceties and what maybe it's Stockholm syndrome or something. I don't know. But it's interesting. I think what you said tracks very well with that observation. The last point I'll make, and then I would love to get your thoughts on the constraints necessarily being unexpected. This is a response to a lot of different things that were said, nothing singularly, but there's something I've been noticing with some friends of mine locally. And the other night we stayed up till 5 a.m. around the campfire talking. And so, I get to really drill down when you stay up that late. And luckily I have good relationships with my friends, so they'll put up with me like really drilling them psychologically and trying to nail down things with them. But I noticed, there's certain friends of mine, because perhaps of overparenting, and something I think speaks to a lot of what people here were just saying, that I call the know better, do better fallacy, where your parents, when you're quite young, say, why did you do that? You should have known better, et cetera, implying that you have, thought about what you've just done and have a whole rational justification for it, rather than just spontaneously acting on what are still quite unconscious or subconscious drives at that point. And then maybe slightly getting closer to adolescence, you discover that if you can successfully rationalize your actions, the level of negative energy you're receiving from your parents diminishes quite well. If you can outsmart your parents or put them in a position where they can no longer argue against you, they subdue. So then you learn to avoid negative consequences of your actions by basically just having very strong rhetorical arguments. And then you want to seek whole ideologies which help facilitate that pattern of behavior, whether that's, an appeal to a holy book, or what I think I find more often in the liminal web is systems of thoughts that have so much abstract associations that you can basically play these games of going in circles and getting lost and like just gesturing toward things that you don't ever have to ground down into reality. And I think it makes for very, very effective, like rhetorical squid inking. And I think it attracts certain kinds of narcissistic tendencies, or it's just useful for them. Yeah, there you go.
Brilliant. I wish I would have been around that campfire. That sounds amazing. So a few things. One, everything you just said is outstanding. And definitely I may or may not have experience with children who go, wait a minute, if I can just figure out a rationalization. And I love the idea of knowing better means you are better in a way, and seeking a certain ideology or abstractions or systems. Because it's interesting, because, Javier was talking about this kind of problem of norms. Well, practically speaking, what I would call an internally consistent system, like an ideology or another term for the truism of the rational, is map, where you can always just move the variables around to maintain the consistency of your beliefs. You're trained to think that that means you're doing good because you know better. You always know better. You know better than everyone. Therefore, you have done good. And so there's a structure of ethics with maintaining consistency that, rather it be under a norm or a map or an ideology, whatever language, leads to a very problematic ethical system. And that's where the emphasis for me, like Jockin, like on virtue, beauty, the encounter, not the, oh, I know better, but the surprise, the encounter with the thing, and your ability to judge in that surprise with that particular individual and the circumstances that make it up and the situation, and to make a decision based on that puts you in a place where you're unable to say that I know better because this is a surprise. You couldn't have known better. The question is, what are you going to do? And that emphasis on the encounter, the limit, the surprise, the discernment, that brings together, hopefully, action and thinking. So we've been emphasizing a lot at the net or in general, you know, on this idea of the encounter, like locating philosophy and ethics and everything in that raw encounter of the situation that was unpredictable. But just because you couldn't plan for it doesn't mean you couldn't prepare for it. And the question is, what is a moral system or philosophy? What is a philosophy of preparation versus planning, or that really locates or thinks about the preparation versus the planning? That changes a lot. And definitely, as a, you know, what Michelle and I talk about all the time, we find it very important with children to, just as a little note, to lead. Like, once they do something, you don't say, you know, it's more of, if you do that again, this will occur. You lead. Because what you're doing is, now you do know, right? As opposed, and it's like there's a leading. So you're trying to bring together the surprise. I think it's very important as a parent, just not out of the blue knee-jerk punish them. You need to lead, like a leading, right? And that changes things. Because otherwise it's this kind of considered. Please, Christian.
Yeah, you know, I this touches on something I've been thinking a lot about, especially as I unfortunately get more involved in politics at my local and state levels. Is I don't think people, I mean, when you say you have to lead children, you're helping them understand the outcomes of their decisions and to make decisions based on their best predicted outcomes rather than on emotional associations. And that's, to me, like a much better way of navigating through life. And yet, when I try to talk to friends about politics, it's so hard to ground down decisions into outcomes. If you vote for this ballot proposition, this will happen or that will happen. Let's vote accordingly. Rather, people are like, oh, but this came from that party or that party, so it must be bad. Or this kind of reminds me of this thing, which I don't like. And it's just all these vague emotional associations and and it's very tough, I find, to get people to just think in terms of discrete outcomes and the best that we can, you know, predict them. Although I've found some people instantly get that and they're like, oh yeah, that's just a better way to think. Okay, I'll start trying to do that, which is nice. But it's the exception. And I don't want you to forget to explain constraints and the unexpected. And maybe you can argue it in reverse. Tell me why, if some type of boundary or something that we might sometimes call a constraint is expected or it is known, why is that not a constraint?
No, very good. Excellent. And actually what you were saying makes me think of Andrew Luborn's storytelling. Like, you have to kind of, in a sense, tell a really good story or really explain people so that they can see the cause and effect. Otherwise, it's just vague associations and leads to various chaoses. And basically, one of the reasons perhaps we fail at the question of adolescence is because we leave them to the devices of vague feelings, emotions, or cultural associations, and then they're not able to think in this way that you're describing. That's more cause and effect and preparatory. For Terence Deacon, on the idea of constraint creating order and it having to be surprised, is because what Terence Deacon in Incomplete Nature is talking about that's very interesting is the notion that the only way to explain how chaos becomes complexity is that chaos encounters a constraint, that then leads it to doing less, that in having less information actually creates complexity. And the difference is between, like, for example, I know I don't have wings. So this constraint is not surprising, but it would actually be, another term would be a determination. It's not really a constraint because it's what I work with. A constraint is something that I encounter and find out I have to work with. And that's always surprising. But here's the tricky part, and I should clarify this. What was a constraint today could be a determination tomorrow, because I've been surprised and I've integrated it into my determinations, the terms of operation. And I should also clarify that what chaos, complexity, and simple, what is, you said it, what is complex today, I can get used to and is simple tomorrow, right? But the trick is that in order to have complexity, which is negentropy, you have to make sure that there's always new constraints that could surprise you. By definition, that seems impossible. How can you plan a thing to surprise you and it still be a constraint? Wouldn't it be a determination, right? This is the million-dollar problem, is in order for human beings to have greater complexity, which we're overlaying with negentropy as the opposite of entropy for Mr. Deacon, you have to be intentional about surprise. Well, that seems impossible. So the only way is to prepare for something you don't know is going to happen. Well, what the frick? That's an entirely different philosophy structure. And let me also click before giving it to Javier and Luber. Also critically, a constraint in this structure has to come from something internal more than external. So like you desire an object, you don't know that the thing you desire is going to deny your desire, like the crush in high school. It comes from that crush, you want them, and then they reject you. Whoa, I didn't know I was constrained from having this other by having to learn to make them like me. I thought I was likable, dang it. I guess I'm not. And then you have to choose how you're going to respond to that. But then as you respond to that, it becomes a determination because you learn the kind of person you actually are. And maybe you stop having a crush on them and have a crush on somebody else, right? So there's this kind of fluid motion between desire, constraint, as you move into adolescence. Constraint today becomes determination tomorrow. New constraints, all of which are greater opportunities for greater complexity, ergo need entropy, ergo intrinsic motivation, without which you're prone to entropy, if Mr. Deacon is correct. And I think it's a very compelling vision. But I should also note, a way to think about this is that simplicity is like 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Complexity would be 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 16. Chaos would be 1 plus 7 plus 10 plus 25. The reason why the middle is complexity is because the digits are timesing the square of the previous. So it's 1 plus 1, so times 1 by 1 is 1, then 1 by 2 is 2, 2 is 4. So in addition to the additive horizontal, there's a complexity of the logic of what the next integer is going to be. The first example was simple because it's the same integer on repeat, and the last one is more of chaos because there's no logic necessary on why the next integer is what it is relative to the previous, right? Now, of course, 1 plus 1 times a million times, there's a gray zone here because is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 a million times complex? Is there a point where something simple becomes complex? Well, in computer science, they would say no, because you could write that as 1 times a million. Therefore, it's not complex because you can bracket it, you can shrink it, right? But if I come up with something like 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 4, there's actually a point where there's no way to have a formula that reduces it from the extended expression, and yet that extended expression is meaningful. And there's a logic to it, a non-bracketable or reducible complexity. And chaos is like, well, who cares? There's nothing going on, so why even bother to look for a formulation, right? But this is very interesting because like in cosmology, they're like, what is complexity? And the million-dollar question is the universe entails complexity. That's what's weird. It has golden ratios and order and things, not just simplicity nor chaos. There is effing complexity. Irreducible formulation when you put it in the whole system of emergent relations that nevertheless is meaningful. Oh, that's weird. So where does complexity come from? And what Deacon is proposing is that it comes from actually the fact that the universe entails within itself constraints that in reducing possibility actually has a motion toward complexity. Now, much more has to be said, but what's interesting is analogous to that could be the formulation of the human being. And in the adolescent stage, we miss this. Because we're not thinking in terms of relation to constraints. Actually, we say, what is your potential? You're going to be a CEO in dreams. Not trying to learn how to live with constraint, but to deny the existence of constraint that actually leads to chaos versus complexity. So most adolescents end up chaotic or emotionally chaotic or mentally chaotic precisely because there's a denial of the constraint that makes possible a certain ordering following Mr. Deacon. And that's kind of in our neoliberal age, you know, the whole name of the game is the denial of constraint, as opposed to working through the paradox of growing complexity of desire because of a constraint that exists as a surprise. That means we have to think philosophy in the encounter versus some sort of universal normative that actually tempts us with a consistency where we can just basically do whatever we want, exactly like you were describing. We are tempted by consistency, which creates an illusion of growing up in maturity, but actually a philosophy that's seeking ever consistency and justification according to consistency is undeveloped. And so we have to move beyond that, I think. But it was a beautiful comment. Let me pass it to Javier and then Mr. Luber. Javier Rivera.
Yeah, so there's a lot said. All Okay, so I'll touch on what comes to mind first, is what Christian was pointing out with politics. I mean, this is something that like Jonathan Haidt pointed out in his like 2012 book with the Righteous Mind. Basically, evolutionary psychologists believe that fundamentally, when it comes to morality, rationalization is the after effect of our emotions. We're trying to rationalize and cover the emotional kind of core that is always there. But actually, Christian, you kind of just like pointed out the kind of like irony of using rationality to cover over kind of ethical and moral issues. Now, of course, the question is, for evolutionary psychologists, there is no moral anything. It's simply our emotions and normatives, like the fact that we have habituation. Habituation as a constraint tells us that you would dislike people eating animals just by pure habituation of evolution. So there is nothing, in some sense, a kind of moral, there's no moral wrong in a pure sense, because it's kind of a particular thing. Now, this is interesting because actually you could tie this in to what Daniel's saying, is that this very constraint of habituation, the fact that you're already stuck in a complexity, not the fact that we don't know what complexity is, that too, but the fact that you're already stuck in a complexity, you've habituated a complexity for so long, that to even argue, for example, that certain avenues or pathways of complexity are wrong is kind of like a tautology. You're already in the habituation from which kind of says that you would not like this certain form of complexity, which is interesting because then actually complexity would entail that you cannot say that there is a correct one per se, and that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And I think this is why, like, even when Jockin was trying to determine, like, there is a right time to fight back and so on. But when I was doing my work on the philosophy of timing, I took Nietzsche's critique, which is a very powerful one, which is to say that everything's predicated on value. So, and I think Daniel even depicted this even more succinctly, which is, I can value being a passive subject in the face of anything, but when it comes to my family, when it comes to people that I love, I might not be able to necessarily hold back. I might not be able to necessarily constrain myself. So it actually kind of pinpoints a kind of funny relation, meaning like that passivity or aggressivity is a kind of really implication of value. What is the subject valuing in that moment of time? So we can't even say like, oh, yes, you should be a passive subject. That is the better way to be. Or we cannot say, yes, there is a right or wrong way to be it, because it's a question of value, right? Like, I've seen people that will fight you for you stepping on their shoes. Okay. I don't care about shoes, but people will, fight you for stepping on their shoes. So, what is the real difference between, arguing that I shouldn't hit you for, my shoes versus that, it really becomes a rhetorical argument of trying to prove that materiality, in this case of the shoes question, is kind of non-relevant to you hitting me, right? It's sort of rhetorical. You kind of have to convince them. The question is, though, and this is the problem, can logos, and this is what Christian pointed out, can logos fully occupy the position of a pathos? And this is what Barr points out too, is that the logos and pathos are split. They cannot be unified. The only thing that can be unified is a new mythos, so a new narrative. So basically, the way you would approach somebody that's upset for you hitting their shoes is not trying to deconstruct their argumentative anger and show why it's unreasonable to. That's a logos kind of option. The way to do it is to rewrite their understanding of the mythos itself. Why are you interpreting that event as such? of course, that's a really delicate bomb to even approach, because a person might be like, I don't even want to deal with your bullshit right now. I already want to hit you. You know? But there is a moment, you could say, where it's not a question of, it's no longer a question of values. It's a question of, how can I reintegrate or reinterpret a narrative that the individual already presupposes? And this is the psychoanalytic realm, taking the psychoanalysis into the social realm and saying, and understanding that the subject is always the blind spot of their own self. They are the object that is blind to themselves. So it's better to propose a new narrative of thought than to, I mean, I can't count the many times that my partner and I have gotten upset with each other. And if it weren't for the fact that we kind of just sit down and just shared our perspective, she would say something and I would be like, oh my God, I didn't even see that that's why she acted that way, or something like that, right? It can, you know, it's crazy that sometimes a new proposition of a mythos can completely negate and calm down the pathos, and then you're able to even enter into a logos to be like, yeah, you know, I didn't see that coming. I didn't even think about that, you know. I couldn't even reason from there. So yeah, this idea of being able to reconstitute the history of what's already being interpreted, I think is really might be the proper way of entering into this dilemma of everything is values, everything is a value, everything is groundless in terms of its complexity because of habituation, however we want to argue it. But fundamentally, it's the proposition of a new mythos, of rewriting and constituting. And you could say the encounter or the event is precisely what does that. Being able to propose a new way of interpreting what is being understood. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, magnificent. I think so. A few things first, and I'll give it to Luber, Christian, and then Michael. You know, the way we like to say the true isn't the rational, because what you believe is rational is relative to what you believe is true. And so that would be, the true would be more on the side of the mythos, while the rational is on the side of the logos. And relative, and why it is very important in conflict is not to add, you know, to keep it in the logical, is because people tend to act out of their story of their own life or the situation that then determines what is the right thing to do. And once you understand people's mythos, what they thought was true, then you can understand why they did what they did, which actually moves it out of the pathos more so, because it's not like in the sense of a hurt, right? And so that's a really important move. That's actually real good practical advice. Hey, if you're in a conflict, ask them how they interpreted the situation. What is their story? That can go a long way. I think that's quite powerful. And maybe, and also when you mentioned the animal eating thing, I'll let you guess what I was thinking about. You know, I think Trump is actually playing 4D chess, because when he's saying they're eating all the cats and dogs, it's because he's like, wait a minute. All the Democrats are cat ladies. So if they knew that Harris's strategy was getting the animals eaten, they would never vote for it. It's 4D chess. That's what he was doing right there. Anyway, but there's also something right there on a constraint emerging when there is a split between the mythos and, yeah, that's right, the mythos and the pathos. It's like you are constrained from not having them split. And then once they split, you are constrained from not figuring out how to integrate them together. But notice how that's an invitation for greater complexity, because you have to learn how to order them, right? So like this is what's interesting. Complexity is an invitation for a human involvement when they come to these kind of human situations. Like that's Leibniz, right? And so the constraint that then splits them apart, and then you're constrained from having them come back together without you doing something. That then, as a constraint, is an invitation, if you so choose, to then act in a manner to bring together. Thus, there is complexity, right? So there's something about complexity that is tied to an invitation for human action, right? And yeah, I think there's that's interesting with Thymos, because I'm also wondering if there's a recognition or a certain like honor or valor that arrives in your capacity to reply to the response of the constraint of not being able to have mythos and pathos and these things together without you acting. There's a certain thymos that could be found in that, and a beauty, of course, that comes together. And so that's very, very interesting. And I will say also quickly before I forget, and then I'll give it to Luber, there's a way in which a constraint because I really like what Christian was saying on this problem of consistency. That's an obsession with mine with the map is indestructible. I think it's a huge problem. And it's also that's like maps, beautiful, really consistent philosophies and conspiracies are all linked together because they're internally consistent systems. So how do we avoid that problem, right? Order without surprise tends to be consistency. You could put like complexity without surprise tends to then become a consistency, whereas complexity with surprise can be more so an order in the way we're describing. Both have a consistency does entail complexity, but it's a kind of it's a consistency. Consistency, you've taken complexity, you've made it consistent, and now it's simple. And there's no new negentropy because there's no new surprise. Therefore, it becomes entropic. So like the people you're saying with the philosophers, the liminal web, they took complexity, absolutely. But they made it into a consistency, removing the human element of surprise by then being above the ethical. And now what was once potential for the negentropy is entropic, because it is an internally consistent system. So you have to make sure your system always has the surprise, because otherwise it doesn't have a constraint to make sure that your complexity stays in the realm of this order, this human order. That, and we can language this in different ways. There might be a better word than order, but without the surprising constraint, you're probably going to end up at consistency, which of course makes sense, because consistency in this sense is figuring out what to do, assuming there isn't surprise, or not calculating surprise, or something that's not in. Surprise is an incompletion. It's a girdle point. It's a Kirk girdle point. It's a point that's not in your consistency. So the moment you introduce surprise as a constraint into your philosophy, there's a girdle point. There's a point of incompletion. There's a hole, and that hole is the human freaking element. So now you have to go into the concrete and the lived and into the surprise. And so there's something really important about the surprise to avoid the temptation of indestructible maps, ergo consistency, so on and so forth. But let me give it to Mr. Luber, Christian, and then Michael. Mr. Luber.
Quick, I just realized this is like my bookshelf. I've never had it on camera before. But this is a poster of Martin Heidegger that my friend gave to me 4 years ago for my birthday. And I just thought it would be really funny. And then a lot of things have been said. So the first thing I want to touch on, and then surprisingly, it gets into storytelling, mythos relation to universals. So I think like a lot of approaches to solving conflict is let's convince people of the same mythos. And that's how we'll resolve a conflict. I don't think it's possible to have a universal mythos. I don't think it's a good approach to solving conflict. So what do you do? What do you do then if you can't have a shared mythos? Like you can have a shared mythos, but not in a universal capacity. What then? I think what you're faced with is that when you are telling the narrative of life, so to speak, you can't be the one telling it. Like that's the crazy paradigm shift that like we have like radical free will. You think, okay, you're in control of your own life. Yes. But in terms of like the meta dimension, you can't take this approach where I'm in control of the meta dimension. I can convince others of the meta dimension. And that's when you have like the strong man, you have these radical, religious takes. And I think it makes it not susceptible to change. Right. There's no meta language. So like, basically the radical position that you have to take is almost like a Levinas type of position, in my opinion, where you can't be the teller of your own story. Like in that sense, you can have a sense of the surprise, but nothing more than the sense. Because if you know the surprise, then you're telling your own story, and ergo, you're probably not even living life. You're probably just like, I forget what it's called, but like these Japanese, it's like in the Japanese culture right now where like these people that just don't leave their room, essentially. They just like stay in their room majority of the time. I'm sure they know when they're going to be surprised. like they're like arguably not human beings at that point. Like they're literally in one fixed position and everything is like they order in food, like, oh, my food didn't show up. You know, that's like within the like possibilities of their awareness. It's so in that sense, it's not really a surprise. They can't really have a surprise. So what does it mean to not be the teller of your own story? And that means you have to wait for the other to tell you. So like, I feel like I made this point before on the net, but like anyone that's passed away, they don't know themselves as much as the other knows them. I can ascribe a dead person like what they are more than the dead person can for themselves. Like that's like the crazy position in my mind, that they say know your, like Socrates says, know yourself. What I take that to mean right now is know yourself in terms of how you receive otherness, not actually know yourself in terms of you know everything about yourself, but you know that you are dictated by other, and therefore there's a certain way of standing and holding yourself that allows for the other to seep into you. Like they're going to seep into you anyway, but you can be intentional about how you stand insofar as it allows the seeping to occur in either a more efficient way or in a more, you know, profound way. Like, just like to bring like, so like when you here's an example of what I mean, and this has to do with like the constraints and that kind of stuff. If we were to do a project together, all of us, we have to make a decision universally together in order for the project to move ahead. That entails that we have to agree on the constraints in which we're making this decision under. So that doesn't mean that we're all operating under the same mythos. Like that's like a logical leap. I have to allow you to live under your own mythos in a way that we can have a shared constraint, because I don't believe constraints equal the mythos in which you're operating under. I think you can have a certain mythos and allow your mythos to configure itself such that it allows for a different mythos that another subject is operating under to also have that same constraint. And what that means is you need to have a shared concept that isn't quite a mythos, but it's also not just totally a logos. And that's where like I think like something like a theme like comes into play, where everyone has their own perspective on the theme, and therefore that perspective entails their own shared mythos in which they're able to like agree on a theme, but yet also be habituated under your, like it allows you to have your own perspective at the same time. So the question is ethics is that which allows you to let the other wash over you. So that means you have to let you have to be not gripping the constraints in a certain way. So like a child, so like okay, so like just to keep going with my thoughts, sorry if I'm a little all over the place, but I was watching Bill Maher the other week, and he was just like, he made this comment that really resonated with me, which is with children, you ought to be allowed to boss them and tell them what to do. Like, I'm just telling you what to do because you're a child. Like, I'm an adult. Like, I could just like push you into the room and like, you're fucking doing that. Like, sorry. So and I love this notion of like, how do we as adults universally like be children again? And like with like what Daniel, what you're saying with like leading notion, where it's like, if you do this, the consequence is that, like this leading notion. How can other adults treat each other like children while maintaining, I could just tell you what to do? This to me means that you are allowing the other to have their own mythos, and you are open to how their mythos reveals itself to you, and therefore you can discover a constraint that you both have a common constraint in, and in that sense you can just boss each other around. Like with all, like, I feel like for me, like the projects I work on, like communally, we all boss each other around. Like there is like this childish like thing where it's like, you're gonna do this at this date, and I'm gonna do, and you're gonna, and like they tell you, you're gonna do this at that date, and like together when we both do this, the project like gets actualized in that way. So there's like a certain acknowledgement where, you're not one of the same, but you're one of the same in relation to the project in which you are undertaking together. And in that sense, there's this like certain dimension that reveals itself where you see the same constraints as individuals in such a way that you could boss each other around like children, like your children. And like that is the goal, I would say, of like that's like Jockin and beauty. I think like that is where you can realize again this different mythos and yet have this realization of a shared constraint. And like I think rethinking philosophy in terms of beauty like does that, because I think it allows people to be individuals and point to other individual philosophers and say, you're not wrong. Like there is no right or wrong per se, but like there's a singularity point of unfolding that you can see within other people's philosophies. Like that's what like beauty does, because it really makes the constraints really clear. And then when that happens, the decisions become really easy. Like it's not like where are the decisions, but it's like there's like possible decisions. It's like that's where the hard part is. It's like we could do all these possible different things. Let's decipher which one. And in that sense, it's like almost like playing a game. That's when it's like play, because the stakes don't feel as high, because it's like in the back of everyone's mind, no matter what, we're making a right decision. And like participating in conversations like this, I feel like I could say anything and I'm sort of in the right. And like that's like a very beautiful thing and a very like comforting and like stress-free thing, where like in other conversations, especially politics, you feel like you cannot say anything, you know? Like it's like just an example with that, like, oh, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, like, ooh, be careful what you say. He's Jewish. Oh, he's fucking Palestinian, whatever. Like that to me is just like the epitome of how we're so far away from not letting other people have their own mythos and basically everything that I'm saying. They're telling their own story. They're not they aren't acknowledging that they're not telling their own story. And that's like a scary thing. It's very daunting. But yeah, I'll leave it off with that. But yeah, thank you.
No, outstanding. I'll give it to Christian, then Michael. I mean, it makes me think of like, you know, there's a way in which the religions with like, say, a holy text, they didn't have a shared mythos because there was interpretation, and yet it was a shared differing mythos. This is the beauty of that interpretation. So there's something universal, but it's differing. So what ends up happening is if you don't have everyone having a different mythos to the point where it's chaos, you know, there's a shared language, a shared culture, but the differing of the interpretations, assuming that people have this ability to handle it, allows individuation that does not lead to anarchy, right? This is also where like a constitution and all that, like, why is it we go to all this silly trouble on where if we say, no, we want to talk about, you know, we want to talk about drones. Why bother to find some out there interpretation that makes drones work with the Constitution, right? Because if you do not do that, even as silly or slow or whatever you may think, then you shatter the authority of the shared mythos that also makes space for differing mythos in that sharedness, and now you have chaos, right? And arguably, I call this neo-reading, like when courts find a new reading of a constitution or of an old text that allows some new phenomenon to be done by the society while maintaining its consistency. This neo-reading can seem very silly, and this is also why theology needs to advance through a justificated exegesis of the Bible. Otherwise, you end up in chaos land, because what that does is the neo-reading allows you to have a shared differing mythos, if you will. There's a differing universal, because that's what beauty and theme can do as well, right? Everyone has that, like beauty gives everyone a differing mythos, but that differing mythos is also shared toward the same thing. Like you're talking about the projects, you all agree to the project, but you have differing views of that universal. Therefore, it allows you to say, hey, don't do that, because the authority comes from the beautiful, or the authority, like you're talking about being a child, you need authority, right? Well, what's the authority? The beautiful, or the story, or the project, or the Bible, or the religion, or God. And you got to figure out how to, if you're going to introduce a different interpretation, a different take on the theme, then it has to somehow work with that theme. And that's where the authority comes from, right? That's how courts work. That's how the legal system work. And I would argue, and then I'll give it to you, Mr. Luber, I would argue philosophy is at its best when basically it's a neo-reading of reality. That's what you're doing with frickin' reality, is looking for neo-readings that maintain the consistency of experience, but in a manner that makes room for the other. Because I love that line that knowing yourself is knowing how you accept otherness, right? So when we talk about order and complexity, the problem is you do still have a consistency, but it's a consistency that has an incompleteness in it. Thus not having it being something you can outsource to, like people can do with philosophy, right? You have to always have that space for the other, but you also have to neo-read in a manner to where you're working really, 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 really hard to create a consistency that you leave a hole in. Well, that seems kind of dumb. Why not just not have consistency? No, 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 can't do that. It's chaos. Well, why not just have a hole? No, 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 it's chaos. You have to work really, 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 really hard to make a really consistent system that then you put a hole in. That seems stupid, but if you don't do it, cap, Mr. There's no room for the theme, no room for the other, no room for the beauty. Mr. Luber.
Yeah, two things. One, like it's very evident that relations are like ontologically first when you realize that how you know yourself is contingent on the other.
Yeah.
Like it is so contingent on the other that it, like the whole notion of egotism and everything stems from like I, like the cogito I. I mean, it's just very fallacious in that one approach to Descartes' thinking. And like that's the key though. It's like not Descartes' thinking as a whole, it's that it's an approach to his thinking. Like that's how you have to treat it. Like that's when you really take otherness seriously, it's you can never absolutize, I don't know, someone else. Like that's a scary, like it's a scary thing, because everything's in flux in a certain sense. You have to be really patient and you have to be open, and it's anxiety inducing. And the other thing is, that's why like I always keep finding where like, oh, theme makes sense in this context. Oh, theme is in between mythos, pathos, logos. No, theme is logos. Like I get confused myself, honestly, like where it's actually situated. And like, here's like another example. It's like you have to have like a shared mythos insofar as it allows you to have like your own mythos. Like using mythos twice in that like not tautological, but like in that within the same proposition, it gets very confusing. So it seems like to me, that's where it's like the shared project is the theme. So like having an investigation where you're really taking serious like what the project is and what goes into it, and like understanding the difference between mythos, logos, pathos, whatever, and how that relates to like the project is different than just investigating logos. Like those are just like attributes of a project, like not what the project is itself. So I think like a lot of philosophy like doesn't actually address a project, like the project itself, so to speak, but it addresses like the attributes that like go into a project. Like Philip was talking about transference earlier. I don't know if I agree with him. I think I agree with like the Freudian Lacan. Just because like I think like Lacan, at least from my reading of him so far, he there's all these things that go into the explicit subject, so much so that like the real is like this implicit, like unrealized, tangible thing. So like he points out all these concepts that kind of are in like in the implicit realm, so to speak, that kind of circle that allows for the like implicit definition to kind of reveal itself. I think that a lot of philosophy is dealing with that implicit realm, that circling, and it can't actually grab the project itself because it doesn't have a term that addresses the project itself as it relates to this like implicit circling that kind of is like the real, so to speak. Because I think a lot of philosophy deals with the real and trying to understand like the event horizon, you know, all these things that basically are like Lacan's real. But yeah, I just wanted to add that. Yeah.
No, I think, and then I'll give it to Christian. Mike, I think basically when philosophers, it's not by chance that philosophy toward the end of the 20th century becomes so emphasized on the other, the face of the other, the encounter of the other, because basically philosophy does this circling thing naturally, which is fine as long as it then hits the other, because the other becomes the theme. Or otherness that cannot be reduced to the consistency is the theme. But then you can easily, doing some psychoanalytical tricks, talk about the other without ever encountering the other. You can just talk about the abstract other in the legal system. That's why the literal frickin' encounter of the guy on the side of the road, the literal face, is huge. And philosophy is about preparing for the encounter. That in the encounter, in the literal encounter, is in a sense maybe the only, well, it kind of has to be, where action and thought come together, where philosophy and action come together there and almost nowhere like there in the surprise. Now, it is interesting. I'll note quickly, you did mention how the Horkonami or the Welcome to NHK anime thing, like they expect, you know, they're surprised when the pizza guy shows up and they didn't order pizza, right? I think there could be, you could say, a difference between unexpected and surprise, where surprise has to be existential. Surprise has to have this uprooting to it, right? So yes, it's unexpected when somebody shows up at the door, but it's still, it doesn't throw off the consistency of their worldview, right? That's the key. Like, it has to open a hole in the consistency, in the worldview, or have the potential of such, right? And then the question is what you do with that. So maybe there's a difference there. And I'm also thinking about, like, with Descartes, it's almost like the man needed to say, I think, therefore I am, so could you tell me who I am? Like, I think, therefore I am, could you tell me what that means now? Because it's an empty I unless I have you to tell me. So I know I must have an I because I can think, but I have no idea what it is. Could you tell me? So I think, therefore I am, please tell me what that means. You know, or something. But let me give it to Christian, then Michael. Christian, please.
Yeah, you've reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, and I don't know if this is supposedly from the Buddha or from someone in the Buddhist lineage, but they said, your greatest guru is your enemy in the street. And I thought that was very, wise little idea there that I think that is lost on a lot of people. A lot of us would prefer to avoid encountering enemies in the street. And I think enemies is used in that context to just basically mean any obstacle, a constraint perhaps. But yeah, it's like you that's where you learn, right? That's where you grow, and it's when you encounter that friction and you have to do something new. Now you've got something new that you can say is you. Man, I think the secret to the net is taking notes, because I've taken a lot. I'm not used to that. That means I'm learning stuff, which is good. Yeah, I loved what was the triple of logos, mythos, pathos. And as I've told Daniel before, I'm a philosophical idiot, so I might have less kind of academic philosophical background. So a lot of stuff, I'm having to like onboard the terminology as I hear it. That's me encountering the enemy in the road. I read some research recently, it came out a few days ago, about how when someone is basically vulnerable with you, even if they are expressing a political opinion that you disagree with, if it's really felt that they are being vulnerable, your willingness to engage with them and your respect for them is much higher than if they are sharing something they're very comfortable sharing. So that's interesting. And when we talk about you know, how do we navigate the differences in our various mythos? I think I agree.
Christian,
Oh.
Christian. Okay, there you are. You were saying, I think I agree, and then it cut out.
Oh yeah, my
there you
internet
go.
connection is unstable. Yeah, I agree that, you know, us being able to express our mythos to people and onboard their mythos is kind of the key. Conversation, storytelling, personal sharing, and then, you know, a lot of the work, actually the work that got me first in touch with you, Daniel, which I've been continuing since, you know, those many months ago, I think is basically with that aim. It's like, is there a conceptual framework that doesn't tell us where to arrive in our conclusions, but helps us better communicate our mythos and understand other people's mythos? And I call it, like, it's a very silly pun in some ways, but the working title is Sophilia, which is the inverse of philosophy, and it's the idea of like a wisdom of the heart. How do we talk about what's in our heart? How do we talk about our mythos? How do we understand where our own mythos comes from? And then how does that help us understand the differences between my mythos and yours? And it's not, oh, that my mythos and your mythos are these like necessarily these two immovable objects. It's no, actually, if we open up our mythos, if we unpack our mythos, then we have the ability to transform that mythos and rethink it, and maybe arrive at a shared mythos, at least some kind of like minimum viable shared mythos. This is something I'm experiencing in my local community when it comes to groundwater. So there's, you know, I'm some like dude. I don't have a college degree. I don't have an impressive resume, but I'm like regularly talking with the millionaire in my groundwater basin who owns 300,000 dairy cows, because we have some shared constraints, right? Both of us want water regulations. I want them because I care about the future of my communities having access to water. He cares about them because he doesn't want competition for his purposes of extracting as much water as possible, right? So we have room to collaborate, which is really interesting. It makes a lot of people very skeptical of me because I'm like collaborating with what a lot of people think is the devil. But we do have shared constraints, and that does afford us the ability to cooperate towards certain shared outcomes. Of course, long term, we're probably going to end up butting heads and engaging in some conflict once. And this is, I think, an important point and a little bit of response to something you were saying, Andrew. It's like, on the one hand, we open up possibility space toward our shared benefit when we are open towards each other's mythos. But then there are times when our mythos are, do at least seem to be immovable and really in direct conflict with each other. And I guess that brings up what Thomas was talking about with like how this all intersects with thumos, right? And like spiritedness and action and violence, and when do you punch that other person, and when do you go to war, when do you need to put someone out of their misery because they're trying to put your loved ones out of their misery. I think it's unavoidable that at times we'll have to fight, and I like to say it's the difference between being a fighter and a warrior. If the mythos which is motivating your violence is, to put it like very simply and in a cliched kind of way, if it's rooted in fears, that's fighting. If it's rooted in love, that's being a warrior. In my own bespoke terminology there. There's one other thing. This is why I have to take notes. Constructivism. Yeah, and so I'm researching that work I'm doing, the Sophilia stuff. I'm trying to educate myself about the history of the philosophical arguments between absolutism or universalism and relativism. And I think the position I'm finding that makes the most sense to me is, and I can't speak strongly, I can't claim to define this term well, but it seems to be the puzzle piece that's fitting in correctly, is what some call constructivism. And that's, I mean, it's basically using creativity to mediate the competing or non-overlapping mythos, mythes. And it's the work of, I think, again, storytelling and mutual understanding, conversation, and finding ways to make those mythos overlap in ways that are not readily apparent, right? So a lot of times our mythos do overlap quite a bit, but at the kind of level of, you know, superficial language games, we don't see it. But if we do a little work in getting underneath what our various propositions and axioms actually are where they're coming from, then we find much more overlap. Because at the end of the day, we're all humans. We all want to live. We all want to be happy. It's just, it's given our own unique set of constraints, that those basic, essential, shared human qualities are expressing themselves in different ways. But the further we can get down to the core of who we are, the closer I think we can move toward shared mythos. And I wonder if, you know, when we try to tie spirituality into that, if we were to understand ourselves, like to know thyself is to know oneself in relationship to the other. When we make that other God or the cosmos or something a bit transcendental or transpersonal, maybe that's something that affords us the ability to know ourselves in terms of regular others, in terms of other people, other groups of people, in a way which is more anti-fragile, let's say, which holds values which are not threatened by our conflicts with the other, which actually only their value is enhanced by encountering the other, whether that's friendly, whether that's harmonious, or it's conflict and violent. So I think maybe there that kind of big transcendental other affords us to know ourselves in certain important ways. I'll leave it there. And also the cat joke, trying to get the vote of the childless cat ladies. This, Daniel, makes me, even though I don't see you very often, it makes me hope that I never stop getting to encounter you. I love that we both found that same joke in our weird brains.
That makes me happy. Look, there's a sharedness there, right? So political possibility. That's wonderful. No, thank you, Chris. That's outstanding. I love the idea of you know, fighting and fear versus courage and warrior. That's lovely. And it also, what you were saying about politics and vulnerability, it's one of the reasons. Then I'll give it to Michael and Javier, and then alas, I'll have to run. This has been wonderful. And it makes me think, and careful, Philip, as you lie down, because Heidegger's watching you from Luber's camera, so be careful. And I loved your comment there. But it makes me, it makes me think of where politics, the very fact that people are so kind of rageful over it does suggest potential. Because it's very difficult to have rage where there isn't potential. Because if someone is so passionate, it probably or often can be from a hiding of a vulnerability or a fear or something, which suggests a possibility of connection precisely because it seems most impossible for connection. You know, vulnerability often brings with it denials of connection precisely because it's vulnerable and scared. And so it's interesting how often rage is present where there's potential. And I think that comes out in the politics. And the last thing I was going to say, I think that example with the billionaire, it's very interesting because what you're looking there, you have found a shared constraint, groundwater, right? And from that shared constraint, there becomes the possibility of order and complexity and operation, right? Often in politics, people are looking for shared belief, not shared constraint. And that doesn't give you complexity. That doesn't give you order. It gives you chaos because it's not a constraint. Belief is not a constraint. In fact, belief, it can be a constraint if you see it to its end, if it leads to the encounter, but it's a different emphasis, if you will. Usually shared belief it makes you feel like you're not constrained because now we have a group, right? It feels like the opposite of constraint because we're going to fight and we're going to go together and overpower them. But when you're thinking about a shared constraint, that opens political possibility. And perhaps one of the why is it that, Smith or whatever, you can unify a nation against an enemy, right? Why? Because it's a constraint. Why can you unify people on global warming? Because it's a constraint. Well, if they believe in it, but but this, from a practical standpoint, has real political ramification because the possibility of a constraint that could bring people together goes down the more abstract the scale, right? Like when you're talking on a national level and you're looking for a constraint, it's very difficult to find one that really hits people as a constraint versus groundwater. Okay, I live in this community. I experience very vividly the constraint of the groundwater, right? But as you go on to a more national level, you can find constraints. Almost always it's the economy because that's the one that's it's easiest to kind of feel like a general that people encounter in the food market, right? But that's a very limited range of constraints for political possibility. And then, of course, it's too, what the economy is very abstract and people disagree. And it's too, the policy and the experts and different things. But groundwater, I don't need to have studied politics or the economy for 20 years. I know what groundwater is. I've drunk that. I've seen that, right? So it's a constraint that brings about order and complexity, as we've been talking about, because it's moving politics to a shared constraint. What are we going to do about it as opposed to shared belief? And again, that seems to be a difference. But let me give it to Michael. Yeah, Christian, please.
Real quick, there's one other anecdote. When talking about thumos and the interaction between thumos and mythos, what came to mind was one of my favorite scenes from the Dune films, which is my favorite book. And I just now realize it's something I never would have been able to appreciate in the book. But it's the scene where Gurney Halleck is talking to Paul Atreides about the Harkonnen. And he has that impassioned moment where he goes, "They're brutal!" And all of that thumos, all of that energy. He is essentially being violent to Paul, right? From a teacherly place, from a place of parenthood. But he's being violent in a way that's like a warrior. I need to reshape this kid's mythos so that he's properly prepared. The only way to do that is to transmit some of the actual violence that he needs to expect. He needs to feel this in his body. I need to shake him up because I can't just intellectually explain because it's at the nervous system level. Anyways, I love that scene. And you wouldn't have read that in the book. That's acting. That's part of the beautiful art of drama, is real expression with the human body.
Oh, no, I think that moves to modeling, like Jockin was saying. The actor can be a model if they do it right, in a way that can hit you. Well, it speaks to how ideas are not experiences. And we talk in the conflict of mind that one of the reasons history seems to repeat is because ideas are not experiences. The idea of why nations fall that you read about is not the experience of a society falling. This is also why people end up in the same drama problems, relational problems, because the ideas of hearing what other people have gone through is not the experience. And it's hard to change behavior from idea versus experience. And so this is the problem, because the question is, what are the skills and capacities that you need to be able to convey the experience and the mythos of an activity while just talking to someone, right? Because you're in the realm of the ideas, but I need to make you kind of experience the ideas I'm sharing with you in order for it to translate to the realm of mythos and restructure your logos. How do I do that? That's a straight skill set. That seems like Socrates. That seems like the therapist. That seems like the stuff that Michael does. And so I'll pass it. No, it's beautiful comments. Let me give it to
God, yeah, there's so much said. Luber was talking about this idea of like a universal mythos. It's like the universal mythos is impossible kind of thing. I've been reading a little bit of Zizek's Sex and the Failed Absolute, and he kind of gives like a really interesting answer to perhaps not the universal mythos questions, but to why we seem to be in this predicament of we can no longer have a assured kind of mythos for everyone, but then we fall into a kind of relativism, this kind of like vulgar relativism. And what Zizek is saying is that because the subject is its own blind spot, relativism doesn't quite get it right either, precisely because it's not because the world and society is constructed socially. It's not necessarily because these are social constructs. That's a part of it. But what the real issue is the fact that actually reality itself is constituted as such. Like, it's constituted by this lack. You know, it's the fact that the subject lacks that people argue for relativism. But actually what Zizek is inverting and doubling down on is the fact that actually it's because the subject lacks that reality itself, that shows that reality itself is constituted that way, that it's incomplete, that it has a sort of incompleteness to it. So, and I think I'm like really curious on your idea on this, Daniel, because there's several philosophers that have been really arguing for why we need events. I think this really gets at the core, I think, of the issue here, is that for people like Bard, for example, there is the nomadology, which is like kind of basically the eternal recurrence of the same, right? Like, we live and we die, we reproduce. Like, there's nothing significant about the circularity of life as such. But then there is the contingency of events, which kind of give meaning and drive to life and so on. Badiou has like almost the same concept, where mathematics as ontology, or subjecting math to reveal an ontology, kind of reveals that ontology itself is sort of indifference to this monotony of repetition. Okay, the fact that there's just pure multiplicity, there's just always multiplicity as such, and we can never fully encounter, like, we can never fully captivate or capture all of the multiplicity. So Badiou introduces the event. Bard introduces the event precisely because of process. There's always process. And then what I've noticed with your work, Daniel, is that you don't use the term event, you use the term encounter. Now, I feel like a lot of discussion around everything that we've been touching on hinges precisely on this discrepancy. Because I feel like when we agree that there is no master discourse, and society has kind of come around to that idea that there is no master discourse, that there is no universal mythos that we can share, we fall into two camps. We can fall into that, like, this is the liberal ideology, that being tolerant is the best way through. But being tolerant has its own violence because it becomes a kind of constraint that wants to exclude actual difference. Okay, so then we have a bunch of people that are saying that they are open, but they're not really open. And you criticized this in the last session, actually, Daniel. So being open, and this is weird because people, I think I'm always very critical of this, is that when people say that they're open, they're only open to other people that are open. Like, they're not actually open to people that are closed, that completely disagree with them. So tolerance kind of has its own limits of just like, I can only tolerate you if you have a sort of limited notion of openness that I can enter in, versus an actual difference. So that's weird, right? So that's a funny way of thinking about openness. And then this idea of relativity, which again circles around the same thing. Everything is relative, so I kind of pick my own truth. In a weird way, it's like we're picking our own master discourses to subject ourselves about what we should do and what we should not do. And then proposing a universal mythos falls into the same problem, which is the idea that this mythos will kind of elucidate in some way precisely what we should do or what we should not do. So now we come at the problem, the event or the encounter. This is what fundamentally changes or disrupts this vicious circle of process or the monotony of repetition of multiplicity for Badiou. That's what's that that to me is, because it seems like whatever is mythos has to be a contingent mythos. That's what it is. And if mythos is supposed to mean anything, then it has to be contingent. Contingency is precisely what gives any sense of meaning, any shared meaning to anything. So it has to be a contingent mythos. The problem is, how do we deal with the fact that every event or every encounter, and this is where I want to notice the difference, because I don't quite know the criteria for event for Bard. I know the criteria of event for Badiou, and for event for Badiou is something what Christian is actually talking about, where there is these individuals or group of multiplicities, a site of multiplicity, that's what he calls it. So it'd be like the place where you live, where they notice that something is not being presented, is not being represented. So there's something that presents itself. So this threat of groundwater, and then it's not being represented. And so you become a multiplicity precisely because of this site of the event of this threat of groundwater. So events are always local for Badiou. The problem with the event, and Badiou points this out, and he's always accused for the arbitrariness of it, is that we have to decide that it's an event. That's the problem. We actually have to agree that it's an event as such. And it's precisely this agreement that allows the event to be an event. If not, it's just the eternal recurrence of the same. It's just the same bullshit that goes on. You're wanting to survive just like everybody else is trying to survive. So what's the discrepancy between your survival and anybody else's survival? So it's this event that suddenly we have fidelity to, what Badiou calls the fidelity of operation. Now, this is what's interesting, and I think this might actually answer some of Andrew Luber's problem with him repeating a tautology of theme, is that for Badiou, we can have a difference of fidelities of operation towards the event. And Christian kind of pointed this out, which is like, he feels that he's closer to the event precisely because of this threat of groundwater. But for the other guy, the fidelity to the event is this threat of he could lose his business, or it's a threat to his business, actually. So it becomes a kind of discrepancy for Badiou, is who's actually closer to the event? Who can pose a fidelity of argumentation that shows that they are in much more proximity to the event? And he has a kind of very, mathematical, arbitrary formulation to kind of determine this, which is kind of saying, like, if A can implicate B and you can deduce B to show that it's deduced by A, then that's kind of the deduction process of showing that you are perhaps more close to the event, that you have an argumentative way, which is, I don't know, that's a little bit weird to me. But nonetheless, Badiou is pointing out a problem here, which is when an encounter occurs, and this is maybe the thing, is encounter and event the same thing? Are encounters universal, like, or are encounters local? And then there seems to be this criteria of determining what is an encounter versus not determining what is an encounter. It seems to be contingent on this kind of absolute choice prospect. See you later, Jockin. And yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot of things that hinges on this, because it's precisely what will disturb and change the mythos. Right, and that's kind of and it's weird because then we need a fidelity to the event if we have any hope of changing the mythos. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, it's a tremendous question. Very, very well put. And I'll pass it to Michael here. I think For me, the issue is that I think all events are initially encountered. Groundwater becomes something you say, oh, we ran out, we have a problem with groundwater. In a sense, a event is a sustained encounter. Whereas I would want to put the emphasis, like there was a moment where chemistry encounters biology, right? And then what for Bard, the events tend to have this emergent, non-reducible phenomenon. If you cannot reduce something to the process that came before, it is an event. And for him, events are rare, as I understand it. There are not many. Physics, chemistry, biology, mind, technology, they're very, very rare. There's an irreducibility that defines events in this kind of metaphysical schema. I would say that there was a moment, and then I would say I like to emphasize the encounter, because the encounter keeps it in the personal and it keeps it with the anxiety. And anxiety tends to be the, Lacan tells us anxiety does not lie. And in anxiety tends to have a very useful heuristic for determining when an encounter has happened versus something that is, because there's something uprooting about it, right? Like when the Christian encounters the atheist, if the atheist is right, then you've wasted 20 years of life, right? As a Christian, right? There's something that's very, in that encounter, very risky. There's a heavy risk there that's involved, right? I would want to emphasize that risk, because that risk is what we need to make sure philosophy is toward. Because again, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case. It seems easier for me for events to be absorbed into a consistency of a worldview that keeps you away from the encounter. Because you can talk about events and irreducibility, as you can talk about otherness without encounter, without surprise. Event is a word or an emphasis that can move you away from the surprise, because really what the emphasis becomes is irreducibility. Now, again, I don't want to be an emphasis Nazi. There's some problems with that, but to keep it in the realm of the encounter, like the raw moment of the encounter, which then may lead to a sustained event to consider. I'm not sure of Badiou's formulations. That's interesting. But by emphasizing the encounter, I think we also know, I would want to also put emphasis on that, because that is something that, you don't know what's going to happen when it's going to happen in your life, but it's likely to happen at some point. Maybe 20 times, maybe not thousands of times, but it's certainly going to occur. And I definitely think those moments of encounters, retrospectively, if you prove able to address them, turn out to be events that changed your entire lives. So I would say encounters can become events, but you see, I would want to emphasize encounter as language, because the question of your ability to address an event often is determined by your preparation for a surprise, for the unexpected. And then that retrospectively you look at and say, oh, that was an event. That would be the other thing I would say, is an event has a certain retrospectivity to it. Oh, now that chemistry has happened, we can see it's irreducible to physics. Now that biology has happened, it's irreducible. But what about the moment where biology saturated into mind, or the moment that chemistry saturated, to use that language from Ebert, into biology? That's where I would put well, that's interesting with Badiou, the emphasis on, because I also think that's analog, and there's an analogy to that in relationships in human life. And we can see, I'd like a metaphysics of encounter that I think complements event, but that also leads to a phenomenology and a personal life and an ethics of encounter. So the word encounter to me is easier to carry through the whole stack of every vector of experience. And I think that's kind of important. And because also the encounter helps frame that place where action and thinking come together. But let me give it to Michael before running. Michael, please.
Can you hear me now? Okay, fantastic. I was having a light bulb brain blast moment right before my audio conveniently cut out. Or not cut out, I just zoom in a word. But I was wanting to pick up on something you said, Daniel, about ideas not being experiences. And I wanted to connect it back to something that Jockin said an hour ago, where he was talking about how from a young age, children can pick up on morality and can differentiate between, you know, good and bad, kind of how, generally speaking, how to act, what, you know, yeah, just kind of from a moral standpoint. But what I think happens in adolescence and young adulthood is that they get placed frequently in encounters and situations where they have to decide for themselves what, you know, if a homeless person asks them for money and they don't have any, it's like, how do I go about that? Do I just ignore them and keep my head down? Do I confront them? And, you know, like, and so there's like an embodiment of, you know, maybe the things that they saw their parents do, or you know, saw their parents' friends do, or kind of read in books or see in TV, where it's like now, like, they're being called for the first time to actually, like, act in the world and really encounter, like, you know, learn how to respond to encounters. And that kind of stumbling period where it's like, you know, you do one thing one day and then you're like, oh no, that's not me, and then you know you kind of make these like violent pivots in kind of, you know, your, maybe your political views, or you know, what, how you spend your time. And that was, yeah, that, like, that's something that has been like a real, like, core theme in my life that I've observed, is like, you know, just this idea of like, I remember I told my mom, like, 6 months ago or a year ago, it's like, I want you to let me fail. Like, and it's almost like I even know that what I'm about to do is going to, like, or like maybe the way I'm going about it is kind of neurotic or impulsive, or you know, like, not coming from the most integrated place. But it's like, it's been much more helpful and useful for me to actually act and see that through from that place than like rationalizing or explaining it away. Like, I think we were talking about, like, how I think it was actually you, Christian, who said, you know, you observe some of your friends, like, with kind of the over parenting, kind of become like hyper rational. And I've seen this phenomenon too, where it's like, people will justify, you know, like, kind of justify themselves out of taking risks in life, being like, oh yeah, I can already see how this will, like, play out negatively for me if I take this risk. Like, you know, if I quit my job and I pursue what I love, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna lose financially, I'm gonna lose socially, I'm gonna make a mockery of myself. It's like, you play out the negative, like the devil's advocate of that choice, and then you never actually grow, which is kind of the paradox. It's like, everything that you're avoiding so that you can preserve your sense of, I don't know, security or identity, is like actually what kind of does you in, is like, that's actually the rejection of your identity in a way. And the last thing I just wanted to mention was this idea of like, shared constraints allow cooperation. And like, I definitely observed that in my last job, where it was like, there were a lot of these like big events that we had to put on, and it was kind of what Andrew was talking about, where, you know, it's like, you kind of are bossing each other around. It's like, okay, you do this, you do that. Like, we were on such short kind of time frames, and we had to execute something, and there was almost like not even room to kind of like inquire deeply in this kind of philosophical way about like, oh, what's your view on this, what's your view on that. It's like, we came together for this thing that we all care about. Like we're, we might not have the same mythos, but we have a shared commitment or a shared unified like why of doing this thing in this container. And that allows people from all backgrounds and stripes to work effectively with each other. And maybe in another context we would like really kind of butt heads, but in that context, like I don't know, just the shared commitment and the realization that people were giving 100% to this thing. It felt like I knew these people in a deep way, and so I think that's really true. It's like, yeah, constraints and mythos are not the same thing. Like, but constraints do afford a certain sense of shared participation and deep knowing, and I noticed it like it afforded a vulnerability too, where people felt like the work that they were doing was being valued and recognized, and there was collaboration, and there was space to like ask questions and fail, and that allowed people to feel vulnerable with each other. And you hear all manner of things when people are vulnerable. Like vulnerability doesn't mean agreement. Like feeling open and safe to be vulnerable doesn't mean open and safe to agree, which I think is kind of how like the whole idea of safe spaces has kind of been like warped into that's how we think of it, is like, oh, safe spaces are where everyone can come together and agree. It's like, no, it's like, well, it's kind of been changed to like brave spaces is kind of the new terminology, which I think is a little bit more akin to kind of what I was talking about, where it's like, yeah, right. right. Yeah. So yeah, I'm kind of rambling, and I know you got to go, Daniel, but yeah, that's kind of all I have.
No, I think that's beautiful. I think a better way to think about vulnerability, exactly to what your point, is the willingness to step into an irreversibility. Like once I say something, I can't go back to a world where it isn't said, and now everybody knows it. And so vulnerability, like, because there is that idea, like there's a sense of like once people know you disagree with them on something, they can't not know you disagree with them on something. That's what happens in politics, right? Or like it's so difficult on the Thanksgiving table, people don't want to share their views because once it's said, then people know, right? So vulnerability, and there's a wisdom sometimes in not telling everything, but there's this, I think vulnerability and irreversibility are tied together more than sometimes the emphasis on emotional vulnerability doesn't get at this irreversibility that I think is a key component of it. Because yeah, that's exactly right, Michael. And like, because if you overemphasize vulnerability emotionally, it can become performative as a certain crying and tearing up and being emotional, right? But if vulnerability is said, I'm going to say something, and once I say it, I know people might react badly, and once I do that, I can't go back, but I'm going to do it. Okay, it's like skin in the game, stakes, stuff like that kind of are. So for me, there's something, it would have to be elaborated on, but there's something about vulnerability and irreversibility that I always kind of see together in different ways. I think there is a constraint. I'll give it to Javier here. I think there is a kind of constraint in mythos. One of the reasons you create mythos is precisely to know how to interpret constraints. Like, should I think about my need for failure? What is the story that's going to compel me to fail? What is the story that's going to actually make me accept certain constraints as good for me? There's a relationship between mythos and constraint. And also, if your mythos for reality is X, you're constrained from making it Y, right? So there's a certain constraint there that creates order, but let me give it to Javier. Javier, please.
Yeah. So like this, I would say trust is that constraint. And that's like, and I think that's what's so hard about even having like a universal mythos, or even having like a shared mythos is because the moment that you get a whiff of something that quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, you have this kind of internal mechanism inside you that kind of goes like, this guy isn't really a part of the group. Okay. He isn't really about this shared mythos. Now, that could be true. That could be true. But here's the problem, though. Here's the dilemma that we have when we start not having a kind of faith in the trust itself, which is if the guy isn't a part of the mythos and he's kind of just using it to take advantage, here's the thing. You'd have to prove that, get him to admit it. But the thing is, if somebody's already doing that, why would they admit it? You know, why would they ever say that to you, right? But then we also have to think about the vulnerability of proof. The vulnerability of proof is always just like, we never get the whole story. We can only give a kind of, the litmus test of it all is just, can we give a sense of doubt to whether they did or did not have this share in the mythos? And it comes down to kind of a group agreement fundamentally of being able to give a convincing doubt. You know, this is like kind of like the justice system we have today, right? You have to be able to give a real, tangible doubt of the fact that they could have done this and that it was probably going that way. Now, that's all predicated on trust. like trust in the face of evidence, trust in the face of all these things. Now, to me, I think that's kind of like the real vulnerability part, because vulnerability is as emotional as vulnerability can get. Emotional vulnerability can easily turn the script on anything and anyone, right? And that's the kind of like that's the really difficult part. And that's funny, you know, because like when I have conversations with my partner, you know, I notice these moments where she can't prove what I'm already doubting. You know, I could just be like, well, that's what a so-and-so would actually do. You know, I don't know if you guys ever seen those shows. It's actually a very perfect example of why trust is such a fundamental constraint. And when you decide to release that constraint, everybody's a fundamental victim of it, which is, have you ever seen the show called Traitors? Traitors is a really funny show because fundamentally what it is that there is these group of faithfuls and there is these 3 unknown traitors within the group of faithfuls. And what's funny is basically what it comes down to is somebody realizes that they don't like somebody, so they think they're a traitor. That's what it comes down to, because they actually have no tangible evidence to prove that this person is actually a traitor. And so it comes into this performative aggression of really saying, I don't like this person. When you don't even have any real proof to show that they're a traitor. But it really shows that, and what's even more important about the show is that when it comes to the end of the show and it's revealed who the traitors are, and the traitors have actually built up friendships within the show with these faithfuls, one of the faithfuls felt super betrayed by the fact that they were a traitor. And one of the traitors said something really remarkable, which was, I didn't have a choice. I didn't choose to be a traitor. That doesn't mean that the conversations we had, the shared, you know, vulnerability that we had wasn't real. So that's what's really funny, was that there was this game that was being played, and yet real connections were being formed, and yet without that trust, you could always say that even the traitor was simply always being this indifferent human being precisely because it was a part of the game. Now that could be true, but there was no way to prove that an actual connection was made or not made. So trust as a constraint seems to be kind of fundamentally inevitable, because if not, we just have no sense of cohesion at all. And I think that's the scary part of it, is like, if we don't have this necessary constraint, we have nothing. I would say. We just have nothing. We have no real relations. Everything could be a game. Everybody could be a traitor. And so even if there isn't a shared mythos, that's fine. What I'm saying is there could be traitors within the faithful, but if we don't have a constraint of trust, then there is nothing that can be done cooperatively at all.
Beautifully put. And I've really enjoyed this conversation, everyone. Thank you so much. I hate to run to what you just said. Thought is auto-cannibalistic without something outside itself. And if it is not constrained by trust or an encounter or the common life or a limit, thought eats itself. And what you just said is perfectly right. This is what David Hume warned about, is that if thought doesn't have to reference anything outside itself, then it eats itself. And in fact, what his whole point of a treatise on human nature is like, can you form a self with thought? No. Emotion? No. He's like, thought is absurd. Thought is absurd if it's left to its own consistency. And basically, like the whole idea of think of a reason to trust someone. You always come up with a reason not to. Actually, if you're actually thinking, like for proof, that was his point. Like trust ultimately has to be outside of thought because you can always come up with a reason not to trust someone. It's constant conjunction, right? They can never prove to you. Like you don't, like when you decide to trust someone, you think it's an intellectual endeavor. You think it's a rational endeavor, but it's always actually non-rational, actually. And without thought, simply choosing a certain limiting principle, then it becomes auto-cannibalistic. Chaos, constraint creates order. And the example of trust is perfect. It always is going to come down. And so for me, that's why philosophy needs to emphasize, again, I'm being an emphasis Nazi, but I don't mean to. It must emphasize the encounter, the absolute choice. An absolute choice is a constraint, a limit, a common life, a trust, or else, thank you, Javier, or else there is going to be auto-cannibalism, or consistency, or conspiracy, or ethics that's separated from otherness. There's going to be some form of pathology. All of this is possible precisely because ideas are not experiences. Ideas are not experiences, so it is possible for ideas to relate to themselves without experience, thus have an internal consistency that is entropic, chaotic, auto-cannibalistic, and all of these different problems, right? Ideas are not experiences, which means we as human beings are forever caught in this problem of having to experience bad things to actually be motivated not to do them, which if that's all we ever do, history repeats and our life never improves. So we have to learn how to have ideas have authority over us and our action, not just experiences, but ideas are the very things that if they gain a self-consistency, destroy us. So we have to give authority to ideas so we don't end up having to repeat forever the same mistakes. But if ideas have authority, they run the risk of acting like they don't need experience, at which point they become auto-cannibalistic, self-consuming, deconstruction on itself. Ideas are not experiences, but without ideas, you can't have better experiences or learn from experiences. And of course, you're going to have ideas if you have memories, right? What are memories but experiences, ideas? And if you don't have memory, I don't know what you are, right? So if you have memory, you have ideas. If you have ideas, you're at risk of everything you were just saying, Javier. And ideas are not experiences. And we tend to be motivated by experiences more than ideas, at which point we then tend to give authority to ideas. And because experiences hurt us, we want nothing to do with them ever again. And so then we get in ideas consisting with one another, and we end up in auto-cannibalism. And that tends to be the history and biography of most philosophers. They had experiences that hurt them, so they gave ideas authority. They exist in a self-consistency of those ideas that is no better than a conspiracy, and they end up not trusting, but there's good reason not to trust because they see evidence not to do so, right? So in the name of avoiding hurt, they become something less human while they're occupying a body. But we have to learn, this is the very tricky thing. Ideas are not experiences. Without ideas, you can't have better experiences. The herd of experiences will tempt you to give authority to ideas over experiences. You need ideas to have authority, but for the sake of experiences, not to avoid experiences. Precisely to get better at the gap between ideas and experiences, so you avoid auto-cannibalism and pathology, or the closed-mindedness and thoughtlessness that comes to be screw ideas, I don't need them, and your pure experience, well, now you're manipulated by a strong man or you've been fallen into totalitarianism. Philosophy has to be some sort of human learning of the art of living with the gap between ideas and experiences that you can only fully emotionally experience in the encounter of the gap, in the surprise of the gap, in the moment where there's good reason not to trust the person because they hurt you. That's where the absolute choice emerges. That's where the encounter emerges. That's where the limit is there. And the question is, what are you going to do? And if you're not prepared for it, you will likely not create order and complexity out of this moment. Instead, you will be traumatized by it and try to revert back to a simplicity you cannot return to without introducing chaos. Or you will close off your mind because you don't trust ideas, because what did they ever do to you? Now you have no self-defense against manipulation. Or you'll go to the pure consistency of ideas where you can avoid the ethical real and just have your nice fancy crystal palace that doesn't demand anything of you. So we have to tarry with the negativity, if you will, to use that Zizekian notion, between the fact that ideas are not experiences, but because ideas are not experiencing. That means that experience is limited by idea and limited from being idea, as idea is limited from experience and being experience. And that limitation, that constraint is precisely why experience can be complexity, why ideas can be complexity in order, as opposed to chaos or simplicity. And so that gap is the opportunity for negentropy, but it only is because it brings with it the possibility of a failure that is costly. But because there is the possibility of costly failure, there is the possibility of beautiful success. The question is simply, what do we do today about it? It's been a pleasure, everyone. Thank you so much. Always a delight. Thank you. All the best.